Well, this is Jacob with the Daniel 3 podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, I am honored to host Joe Hartman. Joe is a libertarian and uh, anarcho-capitalist. Is that a good way, just shorthand description of your political views?
I don't know if it would be my political views, but my philosophical views.
Philosophical views,
I like to
right.
think of it in that way. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yep. So a libertarian anarcho-capitalist that I encountered on Facebook, and we had a little bit of a conversation going, and we thought we would be uh, prudent to record it for all of you to see. Joe is running currently for Congress in what state was that again? Idaho or Illinois?
I'm in Michigan.
Michigan.
Close.
Okay.
Yeah, Michigan's
Michigan.
8th district. Yes.
8th district. And he told me that he's going to win in a landslide, and that yeah. How was that experience? Is this your first time running?
Oh yes, yeah. It's been I don't know. I guess in many ways it was kind of what I expected. I had some opportunities to have conversations with people in the local area to get connected. I'm originally from South Florida. I grew up in South Florida, and so I've lived in this area of Michigan. And this is Ed.
Oh, hi, Ed.
Hi, buddy.
Anyway, I have a cat roaming. I have a cat roaming down here around as well, but he's never been bold enough to come in front of the camera. Maybe tonight he will.
Yeah. And so I new to the area, wanted to connect with people. Part of it was, honestly, I was a little bored with COVID and wanted to have some social interactions. And I have been, libertarian since the 2007 Ron Paul presidential campaign. And since then, my views have gotten, kind of just more radical and more, I guess, to me, the way I look at it is more principled and more consistent in the way that I apply the non-aggression principle and the ideas of libertarianism to both my political views as well as more broadly just about human interaction. And so the idea of running was to try to make some noise and have some fun. That's been the expression that I've used, and I've had some fun conversations with local media companies. I talked to a high school politics club, and they had never heard of the word libertarian, really, or most of them hadn't. And so it was an opportunity to get out there and add a little bit of a different approach. I did a couple of radio interviews. So I guess in that way, it's been a good opportunity. At times, it's felt a little silly, with some of the conversations, the way that the interviews go about asking questions that are kind of irrelevant or not the things that I'd rather talk about. So I'm hoping to have a much more substantive philosophical type discussion with you today. But yeah, I mean, my goal with the congressional campaign was just to elevate my platform a little bit. And if I wouldn't have run, there wouldn't have been a libertarian on the ballot. And everybody in the district, all of the delegates at our state convention encouraged me to do it, from libertarian socialists to my Mises Caucus pals. And so it's almost over. I'm kind of glad. I got a Twitter check mark, so whatever that's worth.
That was all worth it then.
I guess. Yeah.
Oh boy. You're telling me that public schools don't teach libertarianism? I that is shocking to me. I mean, gosh, that must have been a mistake.
Yeah. So much of it is there's a lot of emphasis on how important it is to vote, which generally I tend to disagree with. I think it's been an opportunity. I was a little bit, I was hoping. I really hassled. I put in more work than anything to try to get included with the debates. I was contacting the media companies and really tried to talk to both campaigns and, explain how I could attack their opponent and really tried to lobby for that hard, but they excluded me from all 3 debates. So
did you get any like local news coverage at all? Like, were you on TV at all, or was it were they just kind of, you were in the background?
Yeah, I mean, the radio host who hosted the one of the debates had me on for a 30-minute interview on his Sunday morning radio show. We got a little bit bogged down with COVID, but I think overall it was a good conversation. I got to add some context to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act conversation, and point out the many similarities between my Republican and Democrat opponents. Well, this is something to kind of build into later in the conversation, but I approach things a lot of times that people are interesting. They're just offering their opinions and their subjective values. and they're playing a game of some sort, or games, and so I think both of my opponents, or my fellow candidates, as I prefer to say, are probably decent, well-intended people, do really think that they should be the ones wielding power, through the DC Congress and bureaucracy. And I think that's a little bit different rhetoric than most libertarians, use when talking about typical politicians. But that's just the way I look at both of them. I think they're probably just people trying to get a job, and I'm like this random person on the side, the other name on the ballot, who's obviously not trying to get that job, with a totally different set of goals and priorities, and the reason why I kind of went on this adventure. So
Yeah. So you said you kind of like became a libertarian, so to speak, 2007 Ron Paul movement. What was that like? Were you in high school at the time, or where were you at, and like what was that uh experience? Because I gotta be honest, I was in speech and debate, and I was probably like a freshman in high school, I think, when Ron Paul was really big, but I didn't pay too much attention to him just because I had such leftist liberal teachers, and like my speech and debate coach was incredibly left leaning. So I mean, I had no chance in hell to hear anything Ron Paul was saying, or to take it, to get to get like an honest view of what he was saying, So that kind of all passed by me. I became a libertarian much later. I'm always interested to hear people's stories for like because a lot of libertarians and anarchists I meet can trace back their like initial start on that journey to Ron Paul and what he did. So what was that like for you?
yeah, I would say I grew up, or my high school years, I was more of a Republican type conservative. I thought, basically 9/11 was that, central moment of
Mm.
political, everything in politics centered around 9/11 and the response and the wars. And basically just agree with the idea that George Bush was bombing them over there so that they weren't attacking us here. That kind of simplistic rhetoric. And then Ron Paul just shattered that. And similar to what you're talking about with having high school teachers and college professors who are more left. And to answer your question, I was a freshman in college at the time. Um, and so there were people in Young Americans for Liberty. I didn't get too involved, but I had, some conversations and friends in that group. And the thing that struck me was his rhetoric about war and why it wasn't going to work, was so sound, and it was so different, and it reflected the best values that the left at the time, the left, a lot of the left at least, was very good about opposing the wars and opposing the attempts to impose democracy and try to teach people how to vote and create societies, that would reflect certain liberal or democratic values or whatever. And so I think the appeal to Ron Paul was that there was this consistent philosophy, and I guess one of the things definitely that brought me in was that he was for legalizing cannabis, and he was one of the only people back in 2007, who was pro legalized cannabis, and that was an issue that was important to me. And it made a lot of sense, both the way that he explained it, and not having any, he wasn't a marijuana user, he had never smoked, had nothing to do with that. It was about the idea of civil liberties and what the role of the individual is and what the role of the government is. And so that reframing of it, where it wasn't just about like the Democrats versus the Republicans are trying to be in charge. It was like, the question is, what is the role of government? What is the scope of control that they have in our society? And so just the way that he kind of got me started, in this direction, and little by little, um, I like the phrase philosophical anarchist or anarcho-capitalist, um, because I think capitalism, the problem with anarcho-capitalism sometimes is that capitalism has such a diffuse, like it's just a complicated word now in the way that it's like abused. It doesn't just mean private enterprise in public discourse anymore. Um, so yeah, and one thing, I for a while when I first heard of the term minarchist, I was like, oh, I like that word, that makes sense. And then I don't remember who said it. I just remember this obvious moment where someone, basically said, well, minarchists think that the government should be in charge of law enforcement, police, and the military, but that's the way that the government kills people. Like, that's the things they like wreak the worst havoc at. That's the way that they impose their tyranny the most. it was like, wow, yeah, okay, duh. Why am I excusing the role of the government, in those sectors of our economy and our society? And one other thing that I read a little bit later on that kind of brought in terms of the alternative approach to that was Bob Murphy's chaos theory, where there's two essays that talk about private law and private defense, and he just goes through like the process of how, like, if the market has a demand, then there will be ways that it could be provided, and that framework I just found really compelling. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I've read I've read probably tons from Murphy and others in the Mises Institute on private law and market anarchy. And yeah, I mean, once you get red pilled on that, it's hard to uh, it's hard to defend Minarchy. And one of the things I was in a debate maybe a year ago with a Minarchist, and uh, he rather principled one, and he kept on talking about, hey, listen, I'm not saying the state should do X, Y, and Z, because my criticisms of the state were, maybe not applicable to his view of what states should do, because he was like, I just want a state to do, this and this. I just want police. I just want courts, and just like, minimal organization and allocation of funds for a military if we have to defend ourselves from foreign invasion. And what I had to explain to him was, the problem is that those things are implemented. The state has a monopoly on them, has a monopoly of power over people and the right to tax people to fund those things. And what happens is, when the government has the power to do that from the outset, you do have a bit of a free market going on at the same time. Well, that free market creates a lot of wealth, but then the people who are on the losing side of that, they go, well, here's this monopoly of power that I can exploit to get ahead. And that is what starts to, just go back and study American history, and you can see that basically play out, where it wasn't like it wasn't like socialists and stuff came in and took over America. It started out with capitalists saying, hey, I'm losing, but when you're losing and your only option is to compete more in the market, that works out. But when you're losing and you see this other option of, well, what if I were to bribe this politician to allow me to get away with certain things that I normally would not be able to get away with, or to exploit monopoly power over a certain region, or to pass these regulations that benefit me and they'll hurt my competitors. And really, that's where that's where it started, and you can trace that the whole way through to where we are now. And so yeah, I mean, minarchists, the only failure they have is, there's two failures, I guess. One is they might not have read the literature or understand the literature on how the market can handle those last few things, the courts and security. But the other thing is they look at the appeal of limited government and how it would work in isolation, in a bubble, but I don't think they rely also on what I call like the nirvana fallacy, which is the idea that, well, we can keep the state small as long as we always vote in good people who won't expand the state. It's like, that's a big if. The big if.
Yeah, I think that idea that it's possible to restrain the state. One of the things that Ron Paul said about the Constitution in his farewell address to Congress was that it failed. It was an attempt to restrict the insidious nature of the state, but in its very nature, it is a means to control people. And so the people who want to be in positions to control each other are, the state is a magnet for them, and it's a tool and a weapon. And at the same time, in terms of the minarchist argument, I think that from a more pragmatic perspective, that there is going to be a need for collective organization and defense of property rights. And so the mechanism to that might look very much like a state, but the idea is that it would be decentralized, and it would be voluntarily, choosing to live in a certain place, or having multiple systems of private defense in a certain area. And I think it's also important to point out that lots of areas already have private security. Lots of from places that like football stadiums have a whole system of private security. They also have some cops around, and there is obviously laws that are set up in that geographical area. But much of the customized, specialized types of security services are already handled by the marketplace. And also, a lot of legal disputes are settled in arbitration, where there's not, specific, people within the court system, controlling that scenario, right? It's about private and coming to an agreement. So I think that's an important point. Like, it's not so hard to imagine that we can move towards freedom in so many different ways.
It's not, and Brian Kaplan's another good ANCAP to check out, talks a lot about the existence of these things already. And when you have private entities that are already competing with the already, I mean, they're not free. Like, we understand that, like, you and I know the services the state provide are not free, but they are free in the sense of, like, when you go to choose a court or a security agency to help you with whatever you need help with, the state services are already paid for. If you're going to pay for the private ones, you're going to have to shell more money out of pocket. So the incentive is to use the state mechanisms, but when the state mechanisms perform so poorly that the private ones are already competing with them right now, you can just imagine how the removal of that state monopoly that is already funded through theft, the removal of that and allowing the market to completely saturate that area would result in even better services and prices that would be even more affordable. So yeah, I mean, well, you and I could go back and forth all night, but we're not going to find anything to disagree with there. And this is not a, our focus isn't to persuade people on Ancapistan in one conversation, but something that you brought up, a term that people aren't, maybe not a lot of people are familiar with, unless they're kind of into the same, like, Austrian economics circles that you and I are, was a term, praxeology. And you were interested in what you see as kind of like this compatible relationship, or like this almost like a symmetry of sorts between Christianity and praxeology. Me being a Christian, you reached out and wanted to have a conversation about that. Should we start by maybe defining? I mean, I know it's not a term that can be easily described in one sentence, but what would be kind of like a good way to start out describing what praxeology is for those who might not be familiar with the term?
Yeah. So, the idea of praxeology, praxis is human action, and then the ology is the logos, the study of human action. And so the simplest way to think about it is that, in Ludwig von Mises' Human Action, he goes through it begins with a description of praxeology, and then he goes through this concept and how we can deduce knowledge and understanding about the world around us, simply starting from the point of humans act. And so that is the action axiom, the idea that humans act, and that action must have a purpose. We cannot act without, and the action comes as a response to uneasiness, is a phrase that he uses, where there's always a compelling, it's in our nature that we have to act, and we have to, meet our needs. We have to, use means in the pursuit of ends. And so one way I think about this is that all human action can simply boil down to resource allocation. We have our time, we have physical means, and we have our fellow neighbors and potential consumers or producers offering us products. And so the idea is that in any specific example of human action, we can make a few claims that the person will operate in their self-interest. And that's a phrase that we can talk about a little bit more. But the idea that it is inherently in our self-interest, and Mises uses words like rational in a way that and explains what he means by this, but in a way that is not always what we think of as rational people. But it's the fact that you have your own rationale for your action, and that rationale is based on a subjective value approach. And so, value being subjective, the idea is that we're all out here pursuing our self-interests. We're trying to win some games that we're playing, and one of the ways that to kind of turn this towards Jesus, one of the things that I thought, my first kind of connection, or one of my first like connections between Christianity and libertarianism, was the idea that Ayn Rand, who is someone I thought made a lot of great points, she talks about the pursuit of self-interest. What she was missing about Jesus was that Jesus was pursuing his self-interest, right? He was also, he sacrificed himself, as as the story goes, right? But in the very nature of what he was doing, he wanted to do it. It was his responsibility, his goal, his purpose. And so that human action is purposeful behavior, describes what Jesus does, and it describes how his followers, use his story, his purpose, as their guide to their human action. And so one of the things that we talked about a little bit in that other call was Jordan Peterson. And so I think a lot of the content of Jordan Peterson is about the inevitability of calculating and determining that purpose and that subjective value hierarchy, that we are inevitably burdened with that responsibility of coming up with something for ourselves. And we can, have more nihilistic or narcissistic or, like self-centered, short-sighted views. And so I think like the Jordan Peterson approach of the role of the individual and accepting responsibility is very similar to taking up your cross and the burden, voluntarily accepting the role of following Christ. So I think there's a lot of ways that these connect. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. And I have a lot of different things that I might throw out there based on where the conversation goes, in terms of ideas and the ways that I see these connections. So yeah, that's I think it connects in lots of different ways. But and just to add, you didn't mention specifically, I consider praxeology to be my religion. And we could talk more about what I mean by that. And I'm still trying to work on it. I look at this as a constant pursuit. But I think yeah. So
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's funny when, and I know you knew of Jordan Peterson, but it's like when you started talking about praxeology, and you were explaining people make decisions based upon certain goals out of a state of uneasiness. The first word that popped into my mind, or the first thing that popped into my mind, was Jordan Peterson talking about hierarchy, which you then brought up later. And I mean, that is a valid connection. There are a lot of anarchists, big A anarchists, kind of like the big umbrella, those on the left side of the spectrum who hate hierarchy, that will say anarcho-capitalists, or even I've even had them tell me, as just a Christian anarchist, well, you're not really an anarchist because you believe in hierarchy. And I think that they view hierarchy as just being, just in the strictest sense of there are people who have authority or power over other people. But that's a very, very left way of viewing, very leftist way of viewing that term. Really what Peterson talks about a lot in his lectures and in his books, is that hierarchy is really just, it's the natural phenomenon or process that we go through anytime we are faced with a decision. And you can't act without having a hierarchy of values, which is very much in line with what Mises is talking about when he's talking about praxeology and human action, saying that you can't, he's coming at it from a different angle. He's saying no one acts unless they have a goal worth pursuing, based upon the fact that where they are now is not where they want to be. They're looking to the future, the goal that they have in mind, and they're saying, if I was here, it would be better than where I'm at now. It doesn't always mean that they're correct, but it's just it's kind of like an observation of how people act, and people don't act outside of their own self-interest for the most part. Or I would say really not at all, but then we have to dissect that future, to decide to dissect that further, would have to go into what self-interest means, which is kind of what Ayn Rand talked a lot about, which is, not the idea that self-interest means that you're acting just selfishly. It's a dog eat dog world, and it's you and yourself, and everyone else can just, uh, pound salt. Just means that you don't do things that you're not, that you don't have a, you know, motivation to do that has some kind of benefit to you. So, I mean, when you give charity to someone, when you help someone out, you do that because you want to do it. You are gaining something of value in return. No one gives charity and is like, I guess unless it's forced, if you want to say, but then it's not really charity. Then it's like coercion and theft, and that's what the state does. But no one of their own volition goes and helps somebody else, even a stranger, a family member, a friend, and is not doing it out of some level of self-interest. And so Peterson comes at it from the opposite angle, saying that people cannot make decisions unless they have a hierarchy of values in which there are some things that are better than others. Some outcomes that are worse than other outcomes, and also not just the outcomes themselves, but also like an intrinsic internal set of values of like, I don't know, happiness is preferable to sadness, or truth is preferable to non-truth. It's like people can't act without having these values.
I agree with a lot of that. I think my one of the ways that I formulate, or I think about praxeology as human action is an attempt, right? Like the idea is the purposeful action. If you think about like a science fair board where you have like the different parts of like a science project, the first thing is the purpose. You have to have a purpose, and then you have a hypothesis of what you think is going to happen. And so literally all of our human actions are our attempts at getting the right answer to a hypothesis. And so that simple way of everything that we're doing is an attempt. And so in that way, we are inherently students. The idea that everything we're doing is something we can learn from, or also we can learn from our fellow students as we see them pursuing their self-interests. So if you see someone that's pursuing an interest, you can see that what they're trying to do is not something that you want to replicate. In that way, you're a student of human action, of other people's student human action. And this is not the way that praxeology is presented in the economic sense, as Mises and Rothbard talk about, or Hoppe. But to me, to apply it to like the more religious context, is that the idea of religion is to develop a set of principles and values and stories that are universal, that can be applied to as much of your life, or all of your life, or all of human action and interaction, the way that we operate and cooperate with others. And so this concept of praxeology is that all of us are students, and if you look at other people as students, then there's no way that their opinions are going to offend you or cause anything else. They're just people offering their opinions, and you can learn from their subjective values and either apply them and bring them into your own subjective value process, or reject them and learn from, okay, I don't want to be like that guy, kind of stuff, right? So in that sense of being a student, I think it's a good way of putting it. And then, to one of my favorite ideas that I've kind of come up here is that since Ron Paul and for all this time, I've been perplexed about what is the difference between left and right? Because there's something there, but I don't know exactly. Well, I quite, like I said, I like this idea where Aristotle had a concept of the three modes of rhetoric, where there's ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And so my claim would be praxeology is the logos. That's where the human action is guided by reason. It's guided by what we can perceive a priori, coming from this framework of praxeology. And then the right represents the ethos, and the left represents the pathos. And so I think this applies in lots of different ways. But the way to your point about the left, right, being having animosity towards hierarchies, recent Bob Murphy episode had a guy on who was talking about left and right, and he said, he kind of described it as the left is egalitarian and the right is recognizes the utility of natural hierarchies. And so I think that was exactly in line with the way I look at it. But you can see that the left, a lot of their rhetoric is based in emotion. And the fallacy that they engage with is the appeal from emotion. And so that the pathos is based on that emotional appeal, that rhetoric that, stirs people up and gets them all, fearful or excited. But also it can come from a place of empathy. And I do think that a lot of the left's motivation, even if they're not applying it, because of their kind of confusion, their delusion about the role of the state, that they are still coming from the place of humans are suffering. And sometimes that can be as extreme as, because there are hierarchies and they're not as high as others, so that's suffering. And that's a misleading and an unsolvable problem. That's just a natural existence. And like you were saying before about the inevitability of hierarchies. But I
Well,
think that, yeah.
well, this is where just with the left's use, like empathy and empathy and outrage are kind of the two values of the left. And
Sure.
they reject hierarchy. They see problems and they are outraged by them or saddened by them, and they want to do something about it. But what they're missing is kind of the not that I want to focus too much on this, but it's just something that
Yeah.
I thought was worth mentioning, is the economic side of praxeology that the Austrian school gives, which is that, listen, we have scarce resources now. Even if we lived in a universe where, like, we have Star Trek replicators and material resources are not scarce, they're almost unlimited. Uh, there is still scarcity of resources in terms of our lives and our time, the amount of energy we have throughout the day, and so we can only do so much. And especially right now, while resources are scarce and limited, because we don't live in that replicator Star Trek utopia.
Yeah.
The means that we are using, to do things with are also scarce.
Well,
So
and I think that, just to tie it back to, like I mentioned, the state of uneasiness is
right,
inevitable. You have to figure out something to do, right? You can try to meditate and be mindful or something, and think of that as doing nothing. But even then, your thoughts are going to go somewhere. Like you can't escape the force of, you have to act. Humans have to act, right?
right,
It's not just that humans do act and we can learn from that, but humans have to act, and that's that Jordan Peterson. I think
right.
that's the way that he sees.
But
Yeah.
I think what the left is missing is they think that because they reject kind of like this idea that, like, they don't like thinking about scarcity, they don't like thinking about hierarchy. They're just like, well, why can't we just do everything? And that's not just impractical. It also kind of leads to uh it leads to this really weird way of thinking where they view people like you and me who, like, we're going to agree with them on kind of like, hey, yeah, this is bad, this is unfortunate, these are terrible circumstances you're bringing up, we have empathy too. But we look at those things, and not out of coldness, but just out of dealing with reality, going, well, we have to act, but we have to act based upon, we have to look at all possible actions we could take and hypothesize about the outcomes of that, look at the resources we have, the time we have, the skills that we have, and we look at what we can do, and we will end up prioritizing what problems we deal with on an individual level, on a collective level, ideally collectively through the market, but right now it's a lot of it is through the state. But we have conversations about what we should prioritize, and the left will respond with going, well, if you're prioritizing X over Y, that's because you're a cold-hearted bastard who doesn't care about Y. And we're just like, well, no, it's just objectively looking at things, we think X is a problem we can solve easily right now, and Y is an unfortunate circumstance, but there's nothing we can do. Some problems you can't solve uh, after the fact. You have to live with them. It's just kind of like getting certain forms of cancer. Maybe in the future we'll come up with a cure for all cancer or certain types that we can't treat right now. But for the most part, a lot of times we have to look at problems in life as some things can be fixed, and some of them, all you can say is prevention is better than cure. And, try to avoid this if you can. If you fall into it, there's only a few things you can do to help. But we
Sure.
can't do everything. So we have to prioritize. And that means to act, this is where praxeology comes in. This is where hierarchy comes in. To act, we have to make those calculations. And no one person can do that correctly on their own. But this is where the free market comes in, and not that the free market will even get everything right, but the idea is that over time, the market solves for a lot of these problems because people are bringing their values and their hierarchies uh, to the market, and that influences the market. And so this is
Well,
where all that
yeah,
connects as far as
yeah,
the economic
absolutely.
stuff, which is I know not the focus of this conversation, but it is a good thing to highlight. Where I think Christianity kind of starts to tie into this, um, and then I'll let you share your thoughts on that. Uh, Christianity has this, you know, I think religion as a whole, at least the Judeo-Christian religions have this. Maybe the Eastern religions don't, but Christianity, in religion has this idea that there are objective values. Maybe not like across the board. There are objective and subjective values. I guess there are subjective values like, oh, I don't know, do I want pizza or steak for dinner, or do I want to go to the gym now or later, or do I want to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning? I mean, those are kind of subjective judgments. But then there are other things in life where there are objective right and wrong answers, um, and correct ways to live life. And this is something where Jordan Peterson spends a lot of time, maybe not as a religiously convicted Christian, but kind of using the Christian worldview from his background as an evolutionary, as a psychologist who has studied evolution and all these things, to say that uh, there are these deep truths that aren't so much found in the material world or in the scientific world, but that you need to survive, that you have to act as if these things are true in order for not just society to function, but just you as an individual to actually, you know, I'm trying to think of a less corny word than like self-actualize, but that's kind of like, I don't know, that's the word that's coming to
Sure.
mind, is like,
Yeah.
to live your life in the way that gives it the most meaning and fulfillment and that will lead to the most long-term success. You have to live your life according to these patterns of behavior as if they are objectively true. And me as a religious Christian, I just take that a step further and say, it's not that you just have to live as if they were true. To me, they are true, on a metaphysical level. Which, to be fair, I'm not trying to attack Peterson. He kind of leaves it gray. He's like, I'm not sure if there is a underlying metaphysical truth to it or not. But um, Peterson's an interesting character. I'd love to do a video on him sometime. Um, but yeah, that's where I think Christianity ties in a little bit. At least that's like my initial responses and thoughts that are coming as we're talking about this, is that where Christianity comes into play is that it does very much recognize these principles of human action and hierarchy. And it comes to bear on these things to say that this is the way you need to live your life, because these universal truths, these moral truths, usually that we're dealing with, that Christianity talks about, that Jesus teaches, that are reflected in the Old Testament as well. They are uh, they are values and axioms that you need to have that motivate those human actions, or both on an individual and a societal level. You're going to get outcomes that are objectively bad. So that's my initial uh, reaction. What would you say to that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. And I think, I mean, I agree with a lot of it. I would use slightly different words. Like, I think there's objective reality. I think there are objective truths, objective values. I think the purpose of the word value is just inherently subjective in the context of praxeology and human action. Um, but the, uh, you know, to go back a little bit, one of the ways that I look at this, that I would guess you, at least on the surface, before I get into a longer explanation, disagree with the idea that I would say that libertarian political rhetoric should come from the way that I see the left. Now, in the way that the left harps on the fact that there are victims, there are people being marginalized, dispossessed, is where that Jordan Peterson uses. And so, two of the bigger wins, and at least to me, in terms of decentralizing the power of the federal government and state governments, has been the movements towards legalizing cannabis and the ending or the marriage equality. So ending the federal ban on gay marriage. And these are both things that generally the Christian community was not so hyped about. But to me, these are ways where the government got out of the way of people being allowed to make their own choices. And so I think the left, and I didn't really, go to the part of why I think the right represents the ethos. And so I think there's this tension between the pathos and the ethos that goes between any of the tension between left and right, where the right wants to conserve the authority that already exists. The right represents the authority of property rights. The right represents the ethos and the claim, or at least often more in terms of the tension. They're more for lower taxes. They recognize the idea of free markets. But at the same time, the right also gets caught up in nationalism, where there's the fallacy of the right is that appeal from authority, where it's like it is what it is, and so who USA or whatever, right? Like there's that kind of stuff because they're caught up in that ethos. And so or a better example I think is the Republicans now are fans of Social Security and Medicare. 50 years ago they weren't, but as that became a part of the essentially the collectively owned ethos in our society, that the right adapts it and just holds on to it. And so like the right is less aware when their ethos becomes oppressive, when their ethos gets caught up in the role of the state, which inherently oppresses people. And so the way I look at it, and one thing AOC, our everyone's favorite congresswoman, said that there isn't a left party in the US. There's a center right and a far right. And I think that's exactly right. I think that makes a lot of sense because everyone is trying to hold on to the status quo. Both Democrats and Republicans want to maintain the massive warfare welfare states. And there's not, and so, but the left generally is for big change. Now, the authoritarian left, right, is for big change through coercive government, right? But that's not the only way to apply the fact that people suffer and the emotional argument. Whereas the two examples that I used are based in empathy, where the left wasn't all of a sudden like, you know what, gay people should be able to get married and people should be, allowed to consume plants because of their self-ownership and property rights. No, they were looking at it as they saw, okay, people are being victimized by the government. And so to me, right, like the libertarian argument isn't to conserve the good parts of the government. It's not to be based in the ethos of, I guess, at times maybe the Constitution could be helpful, but for the most part, we need to point out we want radical change because people are suffering and being oppressed by the government. And so whenever we talk about different policies, that's the angle, that not necessarily like basing it in silly emotion or getting like too far like provocative with it, but to focus on the fact that all government actions have costs that hurt people. And I think that that's the best way that the libertarian political rhetoric should be offered, because our philosophy is based in the best parts of the ethos, right? We recognize that the individual property right claims, self-ownership, that concept is, our underlying ethos. But in terms of what we want from the political side of it, the people are suffering, and we're not going to convince people on the left about our property rights argument, but we may be able to convince, and we're not really convincing the people on the right to, oppose the nationalism or, like you see, and one great example that I think really sums this up is the tariffs, right? Where Bernie Sanders for years has talked about the same types of tariffs that Trump imposed, right? But Bernie's arguments were much more about these union workers who are going to suffer and not have their jobs, and these whole, these communities that are losing the manufacturing jobs are suffering. Whereas Trump's argument is these are American jobs and like when you make America great. And so it's from that ethos versus the Bernie Sanders side of it being focused more on the pathos. And so because that was one of the things that, that political spectrum, it has economic left and economic right. And I was always like, what does that mean? And so I think the best way to really to simplify it in a way that really that fits at least everything that I've been able to come up with. I think any tension between left and right, you can point at the different priorities, right? A lot of times there are common goals, and maybe that's not what their rhetoric suggests, but there are generally, even the people in charge, want others' lives to be better, at least on the superficial side of it. But they both, left and right, both view their role of what they're trying to pull the government towards is to either conserve, the ethos, protect the status quo, maintain what's already there from that appeal from authority, or just the other, that ethos claim, whereas the left is looking to change things. And so anyway, that's the way that I think it boils down. And I think that the libertarian argument, being always based in reason, doesn't always sell, right? Like saying like this is the most consistent philosophy, so everyone else should agree with us, is not the best way to sell our philosophy. But basing it in empathy, at least to me, I think basing it in empathy is the most effective way, at least for the political rhetoric side of it. So that's, I think, yeah, libertarianism should think of itself as a left-wing political ideology. And one last thing, and that same Bob Murphy episode mentioned this, but the left and right paradigm comes from French assembly, where the people on the left wanted to get rid of the king, people on the right wanted to keep the king. We are ones wanting to get rid of the power of the king, right? We are on that left side of that paradigm. And maybe this is just my own little view of left and right, and it wouldn't make sense to others, but I think it sums up the tension somewhat well.
I think I pretty much agree with everything you just said. So cool. I can't remember. I think before you said it, you said I might disagree on the surface, but I pretty much agreed with you right from the get-go.
Yeah. Well, the part I was the libertarianism being on the left is something that I would have thought maybe at the super before I got into my better explanation.
I mean, I wouldn't say it's squarely on the left. I think libertarianism has, I think it's kind of the best of both worlds, but it's not just like centrism where it's just like, oh, the answer is always in the middle. I just think that, there are valid aspects of thinking, valid values to be found from both right and left. And I think libertarianism, anarchism kind of perfectly encapsulates the best of both worlds. I do think fundamentally, I see where you're coming from. Whereas, and I had a conversation with one of my close friends about this a couple months ago at a video where I said there's kind of two libertarians, broadly speaking, or I mean, there's tons, but I mean, just, to talk about two of the common types or characteristics you see. There are like the proprietarians, and then there's the oppressor-oppressee libertarians.
Social justice.
But
well, and so there was that left and right tension, right? Like I think the left is for justice, right? They see people are suffering, they want justice. The right is for defense. They want to defend the property rights. So I think that tension fits in well with the ethos pathos,
Right. And it's funny because it is sometimes easier to feel led to want to appeal to the people on the left because you feel like their fundamental axioms are compatible, because it's like you already are viewing the world in terms of there are oppressors and rulers, and then there's people being oppressed and ruled over, and it's unfair and unjust.
Yes.
And then it's like, okay, the problem isn't so much your fundamental axioms, it's sort of like you're not seeing the picture clearly, and I want to try to help bring you up to speed to get you the 1080p or 4K resolution of the picture, rather than this kind of really basic picture you're using that's missing a whole lot of the details. But the problem is a lot of times they are very resilient or unopen to the kind of arguments that libertarians want to bring. And it's the exact opposite problem on the right, whereas a lot of times the arguments that we want to bring are compelling to them, but it's just the fundamental axioms at the bottom are somewhat different. And so we're stuck in a process of flip-flopping of who we try to bring in, and I don't know, there's some people that
my priority is to find areas where people are skeptical of government power and just agree with them on those areas. And then I think, one of the weird things was to see, like just over a year ago, there were there were lots of protests about basically advocating that only cops have big guns. And then, a year or so later, the people are protesting police brutality and how the police militarization causes problems. And so I think, that's the sort of thing where the left, being so caught up in emotion at times, can be very short-sighted, whereas the right does have a longer-term view. And one way I thought about this before, years ago, was that the left is delusional and the right is duplicitous, where the right has, the basic understanding, the value of the Constitution as its, as a goal, but then they excuse all of these government overreaches and perpetual war and warfare welfare state policies as just a part of, the way it is. So instead of trying to, make things better, they're just trying to keep it from getting worse. And I
Right.
think
Well, and I
our
think
message, yeah,
I think what's common between the statists on left and right is that when it comes to this idea of human action and praxeology, their calculations are very short-sighted. It's like it's always the here and now, which is, especially I think in our system, it's almost like made to make people think that way because like every election's the most important election and
yes,
it's super important. And it's like you're always just thinking about the here and now. Like this is I had a not like an actual falling out, but an almost falling out with a family member of mine. Uh and it was because she was uh just so upset that I wasn't voting for Biden. And she's just like then coming at me with all this stuff about why Trump is bad, and it's like, yeah, I agree with all this stuff about Trump being bad. I
mhm,
just also am not voting for Biden because here's all the reasons he's bad. And she's just like, well, if you don't support Biden, you're supporting Trump. And I was just like, no. And then I came at her with, my point of view, which is just that, supporting the lesser of two. I was like, even if I grant you Biden was the lesser of two evils, which is a calculation I even scarcely like to get into because it's a hard calculation, and I view calculating it as almost worthless because no
yeah, absolutely,
matter no
yeah, I
matter no
totally agree.
matter no matter who it's like the slave master that beats you the least might be preferable, but it doesn't mean that I should go out there and actively campaign for one of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And I might secretly hope, well, that one looks like he'd beat me less. So, if I'm going to get
well,
kidnapped and sold into slavery, I guess I'd hope it'd be him, but I'm not going to go out there door to door knocking for that guy. And that's what I tried to explain to her. And I was like, listen, as long as people keep on having this very short time preference and keep on looking at things just as what's happening in the next year to 4 years, this cycle will continue. I said, and I think where libertarians are different is that, and some people will label it as like, oh, you're just, what's the word? Like you're just too idealistic. You're too,
yeah.
you know,
Well, I
you're
think
just,
a lot of times we can come off as dogmatic like that,
right.
where it's like, yeah, they're both bad. Well, one of them's got to be worse, and it's so obvious to them from their worldview which one is worse. It just strikes me sometimes as so amazing how politics and the expansive role of the government makes our society so toxic, right? Like the violent nature of politics makes people hate each other. Like it literally boils down to that. And one of the things that I like to say to people on the left or at least the way that I look at what happened with the primary was that Bernie had more support in 2016 than he did in 2020, especially from older people. And maybe that was because they hated Hillary. I don't know. That seems plausible, but I think it's more likely that now that Medicare for all has been at the front of his crew of people for so long, that the older Democrat populace does not want Medicare for all because they want to keep their cut of the pie, right? So they viewed Bernie as, before he was an alternative to Hillary and Medicare for all wasn't at the front of his messaging, but now that in 2020 when it was, they went, they literally voted against the interests of younger people getting health care, or at least that it makes sense that that would be a part of their mindset because they're looking out for their own self-interest. And the government giving more services to more people is a danger to them because of the system that that has been created that literally pits people against each other. And so I think there's so many examples of that where it is a zero sum game, or a negative sum game when government gets involved, rather than when mutually beneficial exchanges happen, everybody wins, right? Like that's one of the beautiful things I think about praxeology and the way that Mises and Rothbard and talk about the idea of how voluntary exchange results in, I think it's just Rothbard who uses this phrase, but psychic revenue, where the idea is that you get what you want and you can learn from that as well, but also like you're pursuing your interests. And so as in a voluntary exchange, both people realize psychic revenue. And it's not like a tangible financial amount as much as it is an ability to pursue your goal and get what you want out of a situation and get more value than the cost of what you're giving up, right? If that wasn't true, then you wouldn't enter into the voluntary exchange. So that idea of generation. The word logos from the Stoic philosophy, it's focused on generation. It's like that which creates. And so I think that in that sense, the praxeology part of it is that we have this, each of us in our own individual subjective value hierarchies has pathos. We have certain suffering that we realize we're enduring right now, or that state of uneasiness, but also potential future suffering, the suffering of others, the suffering of our future selves. And then the ethos of trying to avoid entropy, meeting our basic needs, and to maintain ourselves, to conserve our existence, right? And so, but the idea of praxeology, or the way that we figure out how to measure those two competing tendencies, is that we try to make the best choice. We try to use our own rationale and our own reasoning, which is unique to each person and our unique subjective values. So yeah, that's the way I see that part of it.
Yeah. No, and tie more of the Christian worldview
Yeah.
into all this. Um, the way Jesus confronted people, the way and the things he taught about, uh, we're very much focused on people's actions and also kind of like what their values were. A very common criticism Jesus had for the religious Jews of the day, both the normal people living and the Pharisees, were when they were so concerned about their appearance and following the law to look good, to not get judged by other people, or to even be perceived as being better than others, more righteous than others, um, or just kind of doing it out of just a general sense of fear, like I have to follow all these laws because it's being forced on you, and they're not looking any deeper into it. Uh, Jesus said, you know, came and challenged people on that perception, saying, "Listen," and this is really prevalent in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's like, "Listen, the whole style of the Sermon on the Mount is you've heard it said X, but now I say this," and it's not that he's contradicting the Old Testament laws, but he's kind of saying, "Listen, the point of these laws was not just that, you need to do X to get into heaven, or you need to do X to not, be subject to my wrath." It's like, uh, you know the point of the law was not to give you a guide to how bad you're allowed to be. The point was these things should inspire you to look into the deeper truths behind them. Like try to draw some examples here to make it make more sense. Uh, the most common one is you've heard it said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." But now I say to you, do not resist the evil one. But if someone strikes you on your left cheek, turn to them your other cheek. And if someone asks you to walk 1 mile with them, to walk a second mile. And if someone, there's a few other examples he gives. Um,
Yeah.
and the two principles he's going at there, the one is the Old Testament law that was really just meant to be a criminal code, just kind of saying, listen, the general sense of the Old Testament law in terms of not the moral law, but the judicial law of the Jewish people was like, you can't go after someone for more than what they took. And sometimes that can be a complicated calculation, but and they used simple examples to draw the principle out. Like, so if you stole someone's goat, you had to give them back either a goat of equal value or something that was considered of equal value to a goat. But what you couldn't do, it was kind of like a limit. It was doing two things. One, it was saying you have to pay someone back if you take from them or you hurt them. But it was also kind of like limiting human evil to say, listen, if someone steals from you, going and burning down their house might be an overreaction, might be going too far. If someone cheats you in a business deal, sure, you should seek restitution, but going and kidnapping his wife is probably going too far. So it was kind of like capping human evil, saying, you can't go, this is a libertarian principle actually, which is kind of like, proportionality in property rights. You have to, a violation. This is the going a tangent here. The lack of this principle leads, or understanding it leads to the funniest ANCAP memes in the world, where it's on the one side, my neighbor mowed an inch into my lawn, and now I send my A10 warthogs at him to because of the NIP violation.
Yes.
Which is funny, but it's keying in on how that doesn't happen, because people kind of do recognize that there's proportionality to a violation of law. So this is an Old Testament law, and that's kind of what it was getting at. But what Jesus was correcting was saying, listen, I didn't say that because I wanted you to live your life that way, where it's a dog-eat-dog world and you go around just like, if anyone wrongs me, I'm going to wrong them back just as much. He's like, no, like, you should seek to find, nonviolent solutions. You should seek to be forgiving as much as you can, and to love on people. And
that's where that empathy comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to view it is kind of also a dichotomy of, like, viewing things in just strictly property rights and hierarchy, versus having that empathy and going a little bit deeper. And this is kind of what I was getting at with, like, the whole Christianity preaches these axioms to live by. And it's not so much, and you brought up, like, psychological currency, I think is the phrase you use.
It's psychic revenue.
Psychic revenue.
Rothbard. It's in Man, Economy, and State, and a couple other things that he wrote. Yeah.
And that's very, while you were talking, I thought of a passage that I didn't know completely offhand, so I pulled it up. But it's Matthew 6:19-21. I'm using the NIV version just because it's what pulled up here. But it's the passage that talks about treasures in heaven. It says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Which I think is kind of like a Jesus kind of speaking to this. It's kind of a mirror to what you were talking about, the psychic revenue, which is that, like, if your focus is merely on your material wealth and material goods and your status there, that is not a good way to live life, because that does lead to wanting probably to support the status quo, not caring as much about justice, not caring so much about not being able to perceive the proper the true horror and scope of the injustices that the state causes, because you care more about what the state does for you. And this brings up a dichotomy that people on the left have brought up, and in the past I've said it's a false dichotomy, but I see where they're coming from, where they say, what kind of libertarian are you? Are you a don't tread on me libertarian, or are you a don't tread on anyone libertarian? And I kind of think that that's what they're getting at is, are you concerned primarily about you, or are you thinking about everyone, and kind of on balance what is good and bad, recognizing that something that's done wrongly to someone else might not be happening to you now, but it could happen in the future. So there's a bit of a connection there.
In terms of the Jesus part of that, right, is Jesus was treaded on, but he never was the victim of it. He made the most out of getting treaded on. And I think there's a Stoic connection to that there. I'm a big fan of Stoicism also, but and I think it ties in well with praxeology. But one thing I was curious, I don't know exactly where this verse is, but at one point it's that Jesus came to replace the law. And I think that idea of, like, in John 1:1, where the word is God and blah, 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 however that's phrased, the word logos is used there. And I think that idea that instead of having this, strict law in society, that what governs us should be the logos, or that's the message of Jesus, is that your actions should be governed by the logos, not these arbitrary laws. And I think, so that idea of Jesus replacing the law works. I think it's
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. It doesn't say Jesus replaced the law. What he says is, he says, actually, I've not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it, because ultimately what the law was pointing to the deeper reality, which I think is what you're saying. But just to slight error in what he said.
Yeah, okay.
He didn't come to say the law was wholly bad and it was completely wrong and we need to replace it. But the law was
sufficient.
It wasn't. It was not. Yeah, it was not. It was only sufficient in this sense, in a Christian sense, to point to us, to show us how flawed we were, and to show us how
Right.
short we measure up, that our best isn't good enough, and that we had need for grace, and without grace and without mercy from God, we would be doomed because we can't measure up. But the law uh was wasn't bad, but Jesus came to fulfill it, and to call us to what the law was pointing to: a deeper reality, a deeper sense of living your life by, I mean, some people would call it natural law. That's something C.S. Lewis talked about. To me, a natural law is just uh, it's a human concept that really points to God's law, which isn't about eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but really what Jesus summed up, which is love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Um,
Sure.
and
Well,
uh,
and I think, I mean, so one of the ways that I look at God in a way I'm certain is different than most Christians is that the concept of God is a means to our ends of developing a purpose in our life. And so the concept of God has been around throughout ancient societies in so many different forms, but it usually takes has a basis in that which creates, in the unexplainable, and in things that we can't exactly understand yet. And one way that I see this is, or an example I think is maybe a little silly, but it's like a little joke, like, why did the Indian rain dance always work? And because they didn't stop until it rained, right? And so in that sense, that god of rain, in whatever culture that was real to those people. Like, that wasn't a god that existed because it guided human action. And that's a different way that most Christians would talk about God, as this all-knowing thing. But like, how does God create in the world? And the answer is through human action, and through the individual. I love that phrase, that being created in the image of God. I think that really connects the individual nature of the way that people have relationships with the divine, with the transcendent, with the supernatural, with whatever, however you think about that, or the metaphysical, maybe, is probably the best word. But the idea that we're always in pursuit of trying to figure out that which we don't know, because that's a part of our uneasiness, right? If we knew it all, we wouldn't have any uneasiness. But since we have that uneasiness, a part of it is looking for a guide, looking for concepts and truths that we can embrace. And so, to me, like, the idea of praxeology, it gets all of the best parts of Christianity are can be included if you think about yourself as a student, in terms of your relationship with others and your relationship with the unknowable, right? Like, there's always so much to learn. There's always this pursuit that is constant. But then at the same time, like, there's a Buddhist idea that evil is basically just ignorance, right? And I think that kind of fits well with the Christian concept of what sin is, being separated from. It's missing out. Like, you're missing a key detail when you're acting in ways that are not in alignment with the logos, with your own unique capability. And so, just that individualized um, basis for how we make decisions is inevitable, right? And I think it's something that is, throughout all cultures, all groups that have been out there and trying to figure out what to do with themselves and each other. That there's always so much that we don't know, that by the best way that we can, or like, just the simple fact that we have so much that we don't know, means that everything in some form is that we're always students. We always have things to learn. And then, so when the government comes in, it creates, it distorts our ability to learn those lessons, right? If the government's giving you free stuff, and or just guiding so many things and regulations, or causing all these problems, and in empowering corporations to control certain sectors of the economy, like, in all these different ways, it's the wielding of power by people suppresses our ability to learn and grow, right? And it's like, in the process of, like, raising children, that's one thing that's really illuminating, is the nature. And this is something Jordan Peterson talks about with Piaget, in his philosophy and his psychological work, is that, the nature of, and this is again something that Jesus said too, but that we should be childlike, that we should, look at things in that approach of trying to learn and trying to understand, and that inspires a humility and curiosity that really reflects the way that we should look at the world around us. Right? If we think we got it all going on and we know what we're doing, then Jesus would be against those people who are so self-righteous. But it defies the reality of our perpetual state of uneasiness and our need to um, develop a purpose, develop a hierarchy of subjective values, and all of these same phrases that we've been using. So yeah, I think that's there was something else I wanted to mention, another Bible verse, but I kind of lost it. I'll come back to
Well,
that.
one that came to mind when you brought up having the mindset of children is this is in Matthew and Luke, but I pulled up the Luke passage, chapter 18, verse 16, where Jesus said he called because people were bringing their children to Jesus for Jesus to pray over, and the disciples were like, "No, he's too busy." And then Jesus said, called the children to him and said, "Let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these," which kind of mirrors what you were saying. There's many times in the New Testament where it talks about having to, you know, having to live your life, orient yourself kind of like as a child in terms of uh, your understanding this and your the kind of spirit willingness to learn, that kind of stuff. uh yeah, as far as like the concept of what God is and how that plays into this, I mean, an interesting concept, and I heard this in a conversation with uh and they're not anarchists or anything, but they were two Christians. One was a Protestant, one was a Catholic, and they were having a conversation about Catholicism versus Protestantism. And the Catholic brought up that uh, the more ancient idea or understanding of God that maybe has been lost a little bit in the West is that God isn't just a being. I mean, and to be fair, God is a being of sorts, but it isn't just that God is a being or in the highest being, but that God is being itself. And that is why God chooses to work through human action. And it's sometimes puzzling to people who aren't religious in any sense. And I mean, because I mean, you're not, you and I aren't religious in the same sense. I'm a very, I view these things as not just being true in the ways that you're talking about them, but you know, I mean, and let me back up. I don't want to speak for your beliefs because I don't know them. But
I
uh,
don't feel comfortable using the word beliefs, to be honest with you. It's just a word that I don't have a. It's like
sure,
Jordan Peterson's thing about not liking the question, "Do you believe in God?" The concept of beliefs, like I think opinions or ideas or values, principles. I'm good with all those phrases, but the word belief, I don't know. I
sure,
mean, yeah, it's a phrase that I'm not comfortable with.
sure.
Yeah,
But
that's all.
what I was saying was trying to regain my train of thought here.
My
Oh
bad.
yeah, God. So the idea that God is being is interesting because it can be curious to those who don't have any insight at the Bible at all or any religious beliefs or uh, inklings at all. Like, well, if God exists, why doesn't he do X, Y, and Z? And the answer that Christians give is, well, God does those things through us, and we would say primarily through the church. And that was the kind of the command that God gave to the church was to go out and to serve the least of these, if you're familiar with that passage.
Yeah, yeah.
And people will be like, well, why do that? Why wouldn't he just come down and do it himself? And the Christian answer, I think the most consistent one, is that God views it as being the most good and producing the most glory when he does do those things, but he does it through people.
Through people
He think
choosing
right
voluntarily. Yeah, absolutely. A
to
lot of
the
the same words that we use in
right,
libertarianism works great for
right,
describing exactly what we're talking about. Yeah.
and that's true to the point where the way he chose to in the biblical narrative, uh, the way he chose to save mankind was to come down in human form and to voluntarily take on the everything, the penalties of sin, the totality of the of darkness and evil. And he didn't deserve not just the physical death he went through, but the spiritual things he took on too. But he took on everything voluntarily, and that is, it is, whether or not you're someone who can believe in the metaphysical uh, implications of Christianity or not. The thing I appreciate about Peterson is that he points to how there is no narrative that is quite as deep as the narrative of Jesus on the cross. I mean, it's a meta narrative, so to speak. I mean, and you see that repeated. You see that repeated in literature and movies. I mean, the most recent one is, spoiler alert for those who haven't seen Avengers Endgame, but when Iron Man, when Tony Stark lays down his life to defeat Thanos, to save everybody. But even there, it's like that. I mean, and that was like, you're in the movie. It's a huge emotional thing, but even that doesn't, is just a lesser retelling of the same narrative of the story of Jesus. And
sure. Well, I think like in these situations, and Jordan Peterson will talk about like the transforming the potential into the actual,
right.
And I think the hero myth of, we don't read stories. Stories don't captivate societies when it's like, someone was having a pretty great day, and then the next day, they had another pretty nice day, and then the next day they had another nice day. Like, that's not the stories that captivate us. What we want to hear is how people overcome the struggles that they're faced with, and people rise up and go on adventures and take courageous stands to take the opportunity to do something bigger than themselves. And that's in that sense, that's the pursuing of God, and living out God's plan, God's purpose, all of those sorts of concepts that I think like that's what Jesus represents in the biggest way possible, right? Like he I think one of the ways that I always bring this up on Easter, but it's like, Good Friday was the result of an election. That was democracy that murdered Jesus, because people got all riled up and they voted, right? They could have let go one guy or the other guy, but they let a murderer go to kill Jesus. And it's like, in that sort of way, like everything was against him. His friend sold him out for, some silver, right?
I am so taxing that to make a meme as soon as we are
Please
done.
do.
Democracy
Yes.
killed Jesus. That is
Yeah.
that is perfect.
I run my mouth about that every Easter, and I'm sure I've tweeted it before, but like I just think it's such a useful, part of the story, as the nature of oppression, where it's not just the way that culture can become so tyrannical. And I think that's that top right quadrant of the political spectrum, where it's that oppressive ethos where people are saying like, this is the way it should be, and they get so caught up that they're it's dangerous. But yes, Easter, I mean, the elections in the Bible, it's one of the first examples or oldest examples of history that we have. And one thing, I know you're familiar with Jordan Peterson, but Sam Harris is another sort of moral philosopher and stuff, and he has this idea of the illusion of free will. And I didn't really get it at first. I thought, and he kept talking about libertarian free will in a negative sense, which obviously got me all like, no, libertarian free will must be right. But as I listened to, his explanation of it, and then I heard a conversation that he had with Ben Shapiro, I realized that like what Sam is saying is unfalsifiable. Right. It makes perfect sense to me in the same, at least in similar ways to praxeology, where, one of the things people say about praxeology is like, it's not a science because it's not falsifiable. You can't say humans don't act and then test your hypothesis. No, like it's an a priori. That's like the key is there are no priors except we start with humans act. And so anyway, the Sam Harris concept of the illusion of free will, in the way that I see praxeology, is that the conception of illusion of free will can translate exactly into God's will, where it's like, we do not control, in any real sense, like what we want to do, like the way that our thoughts pop into our mind, and like, the self versus the experiencing self, and the, there's like the what did he call it? It was in a recent conversation I heard, but these ideas that and I think the free will thing is like a semantic nightmare. It seems to cause all sorts of problems, but the way that he goes at it points to the fact, and it doesn't. My initial thought was like, obviously, that would just kind of turn into nihilism, where like you can't decide anything and nothing matters. But his point is much more that by cultivating the right sorts of values and basically being a student of your own actions and the actions of others around you, that you can guide your free will, but on some level, or you can guide your own will, but on some level, it's like whatever all of the factors that lead up to who you are right now and essentially the resources that you're about to allocate, it's going to happen the way it's going to happen. It's like the single timeline sort of claim. And I think that it fits perfectly in the way that we think of God's will, as God's will be done. Anything that happens is according to his plan. And in that sense, it's like a connection between the atheism, which he's a bold atheist who is very anti-religious, but his collection of philosophical principles fits very well, I think, at least with the way that a Christian should operate in the world. I don't think, like, for basically like the way he describes the goals of human flourishing and so many things, where I think politically he's just like a normal kind of liberal person, but in terms of like the way that he approaches the philosophy, and I just think he's a profound thinker and incredible communicator. So I enjoy his stuff, and I just find it challenging. But again, like the way that I see praxeology is that all of the good ideas fit into praxeology because they're examples of people being students and developing their purpose. And so all of those ideas are means in the pursuit of that we can use in pursuit of our end goals and our desires and our mission and purpose and in life. So yeah, I think that was a random tangent there, but
No, it was
I
a
think
good one, and
yeah,
I'm trying to decide between 4 or 5 different ways I can take that, because there was a lot there, and it was all good. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, I watched tons of Sam Harris as well. Mainly first because I watched his debates with Peterson, and then after that
yeah,
watched more of his stuff. And I mean, also, obviously there's a lot I disagree with that Harris says, but the things he brings up and the challenges he brings are very thought provoking. And the free will thing is a very funny one to bring up. And what came to mind when you were talking about that, like the dichotomy between uh, libertarian free will, as the people in philosophy label it, and like this idea of what's the term where you have no free will? Uh, God, I'm blanking on there's compatibilists and determinists. That was like,
determinist. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
was like, it was, but yeah. So the dichotomy between free will and determinism is funny when libertarians get triggered by it because like the word libertarians in the first word, but Christians oftentimes get triggered over the debate of free will because there's also the internal theological debate over free will within Christianity. You have the staunch Calvinists on the one side, the hyper Calvinists that would say everything is predetermined by God, including who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, every bad thing that happens, God foreordained. And then you have on the other side, like open theism, Arminians who would say that God limits himself or is in some way limited by to make way for our free choices. Is the theological split within the
Yeah.
Christian theological world. But what's funny is like when I think about all these things, the scientific uh, and philosophical debate about free will is really interesting how it correlates to the Christian one, because in the Bible it says that before you accept Jesus, before the Holy Spirit, before you're born again, you are a slave to sin, which is a really interesting concept. Even if you just want to look at it in a psychological corollary to it, is the idea that like without placing God or Jesus or you know a proper axiom in your life, if you don't have that proper axiom there, then you are in ways a slave to sin, or you're a slave to bad behavior. I mean, that's you talked about earlier, like Jordan says about not wanting to use the word believe, and that's also a I don't have a problem when people say that, because that is kind of a Christian idea, that belief is not just a statement of, oh, I believe X, I think X is true. Belief is much deeper than that. I mean, Jesus says this. Jesus says there are people who will say, uh, you know, they did things in my name, and will cry,
Yeah.
I think it was Father, Father, and I will say, depart from me, I never knew you. Which is like, a really, like, you read that, you're just like, oh my God, like that's such a, like a striking thing to read, or to think of Jesus saying. But belief is not just saying I believe X. It's like, if you believe something, then it inspires action. And this is talked about a lot in the book of James, which is something we're studying at my church right now, and that I've been doing a deep dive into, because James gets really big into the dichotomy of faith versus works, belief versus action. Um, and what James basically comes to the conclusion of is that faith without works is dead, which is like basically saying belief. If you say you believe something, but you don't live your life that way, you don't believe it. So, uh,
Yeah.
I mean, and this is where really I kind of agree with where you're coming from. That, I mean, I would not say praxeology is my religion, but that's just kind of a semantics thing.
Dang,
And
I'm still at zero converts to my. um,
well, I mean, it
yeah,
just depends on what you define religion as. But I mean,
exactly. Yes. So, what do you, out of curiosity, how would you define religion? Because I've read a lot of different. I've had this conversation with a lot of people, and from someone who's a religious person, I'm sure you would describe yourself that way, right?
yeah, I mean, I would say praxeology is part of my religion, but I wouldn't boil down and say I wouldn't boil it down
No,
to
no, yeah, I
praxeology is
understand.
my religion. You know what I
Sure.
mean?
Of
Um,
course, yes.
yeah.
No one
So
else says that. I get it. It would be
yeah,
kind of weird if I
yeah,
finally. No, I'm not even trying to convert anyone to it. I'm just trying to work on how I express the ideas and try to test some of
yeah.
my thoughts with someone who has a lot of shared values, obviously. But in terms of like what is religion, right? It's obviously it's a deep, complicated question.
Right,
But I think in its essence, at least in the praxeological framework, in the idea of like the human action part, it's a means to the inevitable question that we have to answer of what is our purpose.
right.
And religion answers that question on some level, right? So I think it's a question everybody. It's like Jordan Peterson will say to Sam Harris, like you act as though you think God exists or you believe
Right.
or something, right? And it's like so everybody has to develop a religion. We have to have maybe religions to sensitive of a word that maybe an ideology or a system of values or something like that. But I think you know the way I look at it is that it's something that can be a collection of stories and principles and ideas and values that connect all of our experiences that can be true. And like just a one way that I think of this too is like basketball. I love playing basketball, watching basketball. I'm a big fan of basketball, and basketball has so many elements of praxeology into it where people have a variety of subjective values. There's one common end, which is win the game, but there's so many different aspects to that of trying to understanding who your opponents are, understanding how the game is played, what the constraints are, the means available to you. And so like in so many ways you can look at any, like basketball is just one small example, but in any aspect of our lives we can apply the praxeological framework and system and be more successful than we would be if we didn't look at it that way. Like it's always helpful to realize that you're a student and all you're doing is trying to do something, right? If you yeah So I think and also there are always so many outcomes, right? It's not like we do one thing and there's one outcome. It's like that one thing is always going to be what we did then, and it impacted. And there are inevitably infinite opportunity costs, right? Where because you spend some time doing one thing, you're spending less time doing other things, and you're less good at X skill than you could be because you allocated your time, right? So it's like all resource allocations always have tons of opportunity costs, so
Right.
by recognizing that and applying that across the board to all human action, to the way that we see ourselves and each other, that's it fills the void the way I see it.
There's a really good parable, and I'd look it up, but take too long. I forget the official name. I forget what book it's in, but I know the parable pretty well. It's the parable of the talents. Uh,
Yes.
and
Three
Jesus
people.
talks about, how this rich landowner gives three servants a different portion of talents. To one he gives uh, five or four, to one he gives two, and to one he gives one. And the first two, they go and they invest their talents. And when the landowner comes back, like a year or two later, or however long it is, they've doubled what they were given. And the third one, out of fear, takes his talent and buries it. And then when the owner comes back, he's like, "Master, I know you're a harsh man, and you worked hard for your wealth. And God, I didn't want to lose it. I didn't want to do anything bad with it. So like, here it is. I buried it, and I'm giving it back to you now." And one could imagine maybe the master being disappointed and going, "Oh well, okay, well at least you're giving it back to me. I guess you didn't take
Uh-huh.
anything from me." But no, the landowner is like, "You slothful and lazy and like, I mean, terrible servant." I think he calls him a whole bunch of names. I forget what exactly,
Yeah.
but he's just like, um, so I mean, human action. The idea that you need to have something which inspires you to action, because I think what the Bible would say is, what's worse than making mistakes is almost doing nothing. Like doing nothing is like the worst mistake at all. Worst mistake of all, to act like life is purposeless, to live your life as if it's purposeless. And really no one does that. And that's kind of Jordan Peterson's point when he says there's no true atheists, because no one lives like they're atheists. No one lives like the universe is just a random explosion of stardust that's just driving towards inevitable oblivion, and that there's no
Yeah.
purpose to it. Because if that was your axiom, and that's kind of what religion is. You ask like what my definition would
Yeah.
be, and like to me, religion is kind of like, religion and or God, whatever your top axiom is, whatever you ultimately put at the top of that hierarchy of values, that effectively becomes your religion. Now you can then go like, well, that's kind of religion in a philosophical sense, and then there's also religion in terms of just like the generic usage, where there are different types of expressed religions that are like systems of beliefs that people say, well, I take this particular religion and I place it at the top intentionally, or they try to. But the danger there is that you can fall into this trap of just kind of like, well, I'm going to self-identify with this religion, but if you don't live your life by that, then it's really not your religion. And that's
Sure.
something I think the Bible supports, something that Peterson talks about, and yeah, I
Yeah.
do believe that that is ultimately true. Yeah, the
Well.
only, just to tie a knot on
Mhm.
the praxeology is my religion statement. The only reason I wouldn't say that is because it isn't my top. It is kind of like a natural consequence, or affirmed logical consequence that I will come to based upon what I put at the top. Um, as expressed in the Bible, and also I think just expressed by logical deduction. Um, but
Yeah. That's the
but
key.
it's kind of, it's kind of a semantics thing at the end of the
Sure.
day. Uh, but ultimately what I put at the top, as like what I put my faith in and what I try to live my life around, is that uh you know that God is real, that the historical story of Jesus is true and really happened, and that the one thing that I think, the other thing I said before that I'll come back to, is that whether you want to call them values or moral laws or whatever, I do think, although praxeology deals with subjective values in terms of like, they are subjective in the sense of each person has to decide for themselves what they value, and that's true. I agree with that. Uh, but then there's the sense of objective moral values, or objective moral laws, dealing with people can value one thing over another, but there are certain modes of behavior that are just objectively wrong, and those that are objectively right. And there's also stuff that's just in the middle, and the
Yeah.
Bible's even clear about that. There are some things that, you know hey, for you this might be something that you find personally wrong, but it's not wrong if another person does it. There is some gray area there, but I think where I think Christianity can bring something, I think there's a lot of compatibility between libertarianism, praxeology, and Christianity. And the only thing that as a Christian I would say to libertarians uh, of all persuasions is just that uh, when you're talking about human action and the marketplace and people being able to self-govern. I mean, this is a libertarian idea, is that we can self-govern. We don't need the state to be this set of people who are ruling over us and who have the special rights and abilities to do things that we're not allowed to do. We reject that, and I'm with you. I reject that. Um, but you can't take that away and then just put nothing in its place. Just kind of like how this is kind of like Peterson's criticism to Harris and the New
Yep.
Atheists.
Yep.
It's just like you can't say uh, there's no good reason to believe in God, reject religion, and then that's it. Nothing goes in its place. Like that is not how it works. Now, uh, do I think I'm going to be able to convince every person in the world to be a devout church-going Christian? No, I don't. I don't think
Yeah.
that. But I do think that we have to at least all agree on a common set of things that are objectively wrong and objectively good, and we have to. And I think that on some level, people do have this, and this is kind of
But
what C.S.
by
Lewis
one thing I
talks
just
about in
don't see
Natural
is,
Law. But
uh,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, but in the sense of like, like what's the purpose of asserting that it's an objective value, right? Like I feel like by making the claim that there are objective values that everyone needs to ascribe to, not that I disagree with that premise, but I think by framing it that way, it reduces the importance of that these ideas need to be expressed in a way that is persuasive. And if you think about it in the sense of like trying to train up a child, right? Like
Sure.
the child is not going to objectively understand necessarily that it's wrong to, hit another child or something like that. We need to be
Oh,
able to
I
persuade them to adopt the what we think of as objective moral truths into their subjective value hierarchies. They're going to have a unique reason of understanding why this is right and wrong, right?
I
So I think,
I hundred
yeah, yeah,
percent agree with that, and this is actually something Peterson and Shapiro talked about a couple years back. And the Bible isn't just a set of rules of this is bad and this is good. Those values are derived from the stories, from the whether you believe them to be myths and narratives, or you believe them to be historical retellings to one extent or the other.
sure.
The moral, I mean, sure, there are brief instances in the Bible where there's explicit, you shall not do this, you shall not do that. But that's kind of like basic. Most of the moral teachings of the Bible are taught in story. I mean, even Jesus taught
Yeah.
primarily in
Oh yeah,
story.
absolutely.
So I
One of my
agree.
favorite, yeah,
Yeah,
one of my
I agree
favorite
that.
Bible stories is Esther,
Oh
where
yeah,
like,
yeah,
just the way that they tell the story, it's like I remember at the beginning of it, it's like mentioned 3 or 4 times that she's beautiful, she's so fine, and like she's this beautiful woman, and then the guy who tries to kill her and her uncle, I think, he gets hung in his own gallows. That's the end of the story. Spoiler alert, but like it's just
right.
a beautiful story of how like someone doing the right thing and just God blessing them with talents, like you had mentioned the story of talents. It made me think of Esther in terms of, and then utilizing those talents. She was obviously in a bad, like she basically sold into be a concubine of sorts, but she was like the favorite wife, I guess. But it was like still the idea is that she maximized, she used her natural resources and her abilities to connect with the king and save her entire
Right.
community of
She
people.
and
Her,
she
yeah,
it's just like everything in the Bible, it's a reflection of Jesus. She picked
yes,
up her
yeah,
cross, she bore it nobly, and she overcame evil with good. And that's the
exactly,
primary
exactly, yes.
moral ethic the Bible teaches. And uh I just think that society needs that.
Well,
Whether or
and
not,
yeah,
and it's like I could make this into, I mean, because it's like I have two concerns. One, I do care about people's uh faith and their souls, and I'm not a big person who talks about like heaven and hell. I care more about, God put us here on this earth for a reason, and I think that people's lives would be better if they had that personal connection with God and religion that I have. But And I think that's ultimately what salvation is I don't get too caught up in the heaven and hell stuff, but I do get caught up into, well, you're living your life here on earth. How good can you make it? And I think accepting these things as true is the best way. But on a more fundamental societal level, we absolutely have to, I think, this is where Peterson does his work is incredible to me, because he gets this, I think, is that I think that when people have become more secular and they've rejected religion, but if you don't replace that with something, uh society just can't function. And I think that, especially a libertarian society, we're talking about people self-governing. Well, they're going to self-govern based on what? Their values. But the market can work out this stuff uh, to a point. I think people can, within the market, bring their values to bear. Uh, but uh, I do think that if you're talking about a libertarian society that is completely secular, that's rejected all religion, and every single person is just coming up with their own subjective value for how they operate based, and I'm not talking about just values like, do I want pizza or do I want a salad? I'm talking about like what values, like what is moral and what is immoral, what is right and wrong. Is it wrong to tread on people, even, because some people, they do care more primarily about freedom for them, but not so much freedom for their neighbor.
Sure.
And uh, this is where, like, the religious arguments people get into with Sam Harris and stuff. It's like, if you don't have this underlying metaphysical belief in God and these objective senses of right and wrong, it's like, where do you derive them from? Because clumps of
See,
stardust
and yeah,
don't have any concern about what stardust does to other clumps of stardust. You know what I mean?
sure.
Like, if it's all ultimately
Yeah.
purposeless and whatnot, all we have are subjective preferences. But you can't. I mean, you could say in a marketplace, maybe rational self-interest wins out, and people will and I can see that. I don't think that without God, everyone kills everyone. But I think that the society that comes out in a libertarian sense, out of the market, where everyone's values are different, is a much more potentially scary world than a world where, sure, our values are subjective, but uh, the society at its core is fueled by this underlying metaphysical ethic that I think is best taught in the Bible.
Yeah, I think to talk about the Jordan and Sam Harris conversations, I thought Brett Weinstein in those offered a really useful perspective of his. He seems to have a real affection for the way that Jordan comes out of his affection for Judaism as a collection of stories and values that evolved to fulfill this gap. This, and one of the things you said that I look at a little bit differently, I guess, is that God put us here for a reason. Well, and it's like, that's fine. I don't disagree with that as a sentence, right? Like, that's the way that you define God. But I think that it's also true that we are here for a reason, because we have to have a reason to act, and we have to act. So, like, just built into the human action as purposeful behavior is that we have to have a reason. It's not that, like,
Sure.
we
Well,
must be here for a reason, and if there isn't some bigger metaphysical story, then we don't have a reason. Like, we still need reasons to figure out what to do with ourselves, to figure out how to govern our own actions, and whatever else. And it's not that I disagree with the way you put it. It's just that in terms of the way that I translated into my praxeology. And one other verse, that since you mentioned the book of James, James 1:25 says something about the perfect law of liberty, and it turns you from someone who listens into an actor who does. And I
right.
think, like, what that's talking about is freeing yourself from that bondage of sin. And I think it's the idea is about living according to your logos, rather than the burdens of your pathos and ethos, rather than the burdens of trying to maintain what you think you have control over, or to focus on mitigating your suffering, right? Like, rather than either one of those, you need to follow your purpose, follow your reason, and be in your most essential, like, like what motivates you, the sort of internal rhetoric, that guides your path is the logos, is the reason, is the realization that we have a purpose, that we are burdened with that purpose, in one sense, but it's also an immense opportunity. It's also an inescapable opportunity. So it's like this, like we have to have a reason to do things. And so, yeah, sure. I mean, God put us here for a reason is a good way of thinking about that. But even if you don't believe in God, you still have to have a reason, and I think so that's, yeah. And that verse, James 1:25, I think really, the law of liberty was a phrase that caught my eye. I remember when I was, reading through some stuff, and that was just a verse that I think really, gets it it just presents the concept of how it frees you from that burden of sin, being a slave to sin, like you had said before. And so by being a student, by pursuing something bigger than yourself, just because that's the nature of what you're going to be. Your future self is going to be impacted by your yesterday self. So that dynamic is something that instills us with an inherent purpose that we cannot escape. Like, yeah. So
Yeah.
think,
Yeah. I mean, there's not much major conflict between what the things that we're saying. I guess I just have a sense that if you don't believe in the underlying metaphysical truths of the Bible, there's less reason to take them seriously. And
I don't. That's a Paul thing, right? I think that's in Romans or something where he says like, if there isn't a heaven, then this is all for nothing. I would have rather whatever done. I don't remember the specifics, but I know that that's in there somewhere. And that was always something that maybe it's in Corinthians, or anyway, it's in one of those where he's writing and he talks about like, yeah, if it's not for some like glorious afterlife, basically, then it
well,
wasn't worth it. I don't buy that at all. Yeah.
And to clear, I'm not someone who, I mean, it's just not in my nature, my personality, and I'm not a theologian, so I'm not trying to make this into a dissertation about heaven or hell. But I don't think about heaven and hell that much in my daily life. So I'm not coming at it from that way. But I think when Paul's talking about heaven, it's not just like, hey, where are you going to end up? It's not the guy in the corner of the street holding up that sign, where are you going? And, all the stuff about hell. It's like, I see those Christians.
Repent. Yeah.
Yeah. I see those Christians and they irritate me to no end.
All I can see is that they're logs in their eyes. They just have big logs in their eyes, right? That's the concept that I always imagine. I have, plenty of logs in my own eyes. I don't mean to judge them. It's just like, how can you be so judgmental when Jesus is supposed to be the person that you're emulating?
Jesus criticized sin and behavior, but he did it by like in speaking directly into people's lives and talking about specific modes of behavior that were good and not good. He just didn't, the Sermon on the Mount wasn't him getting up and going, "You're all sinners and you're going to hell."
Yes, exactly.
That wasn't his message. But I think the phrase, whatever it is, where Paul's saying, if there is no heaven, then all this is purposeless, is not so much about your destination, but just the underlying motivations for why we do what we do, why we value the things we value. And I don't know what your metaphysical beliefs are, but for me, it's just, I cannot view us as just being atoms. I can't view us as just being, stardust that through a series of millions of years of interactions formed microorganisms that then evolved into the complex biological machines we are today, but that ultimately at the end of the day, all we are reducible to is just stardust and energy. And it's like, if that's all we are, then I mean, sure, I still have to go out and act. Nihilism isn't a super popular philosophy because it's just like, it's not practical. Like, you still end up going out and acting things out. But I just feel like you talked about wanting to make a persuasive case. And to me, it's like, I agree. I want there to be a persuasive case for morality. I don't believe that, and I think God believes that too. Otherwise, he would have just had a rule book of like, this is all the things that are right, and these are all the things that are wrong. But he didn't do that. He chose to communicate primarily through story, because turns out that is kind of the best way to communicate complex, to raise children, in understanding morality, and B, to kind of get at teaching at deeper moral principles. Because Turns out life is complicated, and it's hard to just come up with a universal code of how to act without like showing examples of people acting and showing how it worked out and how it didn't work out. Um, so I agree in being persuasive, but if the persuasiveness ends in, well, these are just uh, the most beneficial modes of behavior that we've come to believe based upon evolution, it just doesn't really have the oomph that I think is uh, required. And don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, if people can get there, if they can get to that set of moral beliefs, and we had those common moral beliefs, if the world was filled with Christians and people who aren't devout Christians, but they were Jordan Peterson types, that I'd be great with that. But unfortunately, it seems to me that a lot of people reject the metaphysical stuff, and sure, there are a lot of people that like Jordan stuff, but I think what's appealing about these stories uh, is that they speak to a deeper metaphysical. Like Jordan leaves it in the air, like there might be an underlying deeper metaphysical truth, and to me, it's like there is.
Yeah,
That's
and
my only
sure.
pushback.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I would say, we come down on different sides of that. Where, like, to me, like Jordan, it captures the most essential aspect of it, where it doesn't get cluttered by metaphysical. Well, metaphysical is maybe not the right word, because it is still, about the physical world. Like, it doesn't get into supernatural. It doesn't get into, heaven and hell, afterlife, any of that stuff. But that, in its very nature, the purpose of these stories, and the utility of these stories can guide us in what we definitely know we are experiencing, like the nature of conscious minds. And I, one thing that I, in terms of like afterlife and all that kind of stuff, that was something that I just struggled with, like as a young person growing up in church, and seeing the utility of the Bible, and definitely, like, aspiring to live according to certain values. And I could just never really convince myself that the heaven and hell part made much sense. It always just seemed something that I just wasn't able to believe in, I guess, or believe in anything really. So instead, I formulated in a slightly different way, and that's why Jordan Peterson was so profound to me, because he like loves the Bible in a way that I had never heard anybody love the Bible. And there are other people who, there's a preacher named John Piper, who has,
Yes.
I found him incredible. And I've listened to a lot, I mean, years ago, but I listened to a lot of his stuff, and I thought, desiring God was fulfilled when you're, joyful and rejoicing in Him. And a lot of his content, he loves the Bible, and he always communicate in such a way that's so humble. Where, like, a lot of times preachers, it's very like they tell stories about themselves, and it's like kind of self-aggrandizing or whatever. But I appreciated, both from Jordan and John Piper, as like a similar style of speaker, where they're coming from this as humble, and in just like in this deep admiration for the stories and the words and the scripture that they're talking about. But the fact that Jordan doesn't get, in any way caught up, or doesn't think it's necessary to have any other part of it other than, trying to live a good life and not worrying about any afterlife, or hypothetical afterlife, or whatever. And I think that, a lot of people are, struggle at my where, we see that Jesus, is pretty great, and yet when it comes to, uh connecting that with some of the more dogmatic parts of religion, that's a challenge. And one thing that I changed my perception of in more recent years was, the idea of the, the way that the Catholic Church operates with, I'm missing the word, but the rituals,
The liturgy.
the liturgy. Yes,
Yeah.
there's another word I was trying to come up with too, but anyway, yeah, the rituals that, and so these processes that to me always seemed kind of repetitive, and I didn't really understand the purpose of. But from looking at it, and from seeing people, who I know personally, who, take these things so seriously, and have such a deep value for these processes that help guide them in, what I see as their life as students of human action, of trying to learn how to live their lives, that these rituals help guide them, help give them structure, as a part of their hierarchy of subjective values. That someone's, just fairly happy-go-lucky all the time, but then when it comes time for the communion, they're very the entire body language changes. And seeing, people have that relationship with a process, with something that they hold in such high regard and such, sacred, it's something that I think I can see the utility of that. And I think that the heaven and hell, the afterlife, all of that sort of, or even, like the supernatural part of it, that's a part of that, where it's like it's a part of the story that helps, guide people. And whether it's right or wrong, I don't think is really even a part. I have no opinion on that, honestly. Like, to me, whatever, fine. I think the Hindu idea of reincarnation sounds more fun to me. Like, if I'm going to come back as a different type of animal, cool. That sounds more fun than going in heaven with like gold streets and old people or something. Like, I don't really know, but I think that there are lots of details and approaches that people have used and shared, and they all boil down to this fact that we inevitably have to live according to some purpose, or that all of our actions have to be based on some reasons, either that we come up with or that are imposed on us. And so I think that's why the anarchy stuff is so great, because it's about, maximizing the amount of individual pursuit of interest, which is the way that we express our reasoning, our rationale, our logos. And in that God as logos, in the way Jordan Peterson talks about it, is so that praxis plus logos is the way that I see just like the goal of religion. And as one kind of weird little turn, there's a guy named Mark Manson. I don't know if he's a writer, interesting character. It's like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F was one of his books, and like Everything is F'd was another book. But it's very similar to Jordan Peterson's style of content, just with a lot of F-bombs, and it's very, very funny. But the overall mentality of it, in one of his books, he describes how basically, artificial intelligence is dangerous, and we're hoping, and his, kind of the way that the book Everything is F'd, story about hope or something like that. But his part at the end talks about this idea that hopefully artificial intelligence, because it's going to become so powerful, will, recognize that humans need to have this, balance of suffering and restrictions and obstacles to overcome, so that we can, and it's kind of silly the way that he describes it. But to me, like, one of the things that I thought of before I read that book, was that praxeology would be potentially the religion of artificial intelligence, right? We want artificial intelligence to be students of human action, to try to learn from us and recognize that each individual is unique in their own way. And in that way, we are divine as individuals. So the fears about artificial intelligence, like killing people based on, kind of utilitarian leanings, that wouldn't happen because, and this is getting a little bit, whatever, this is about as far as my praxeology crazy religion stuff goes. But I think in the concept of what we could hope for the world to be governed by, is this concept that humans act. And so that process of determining our own purpose, whether in the Christian sense or the Buddhist sense or whatever other religions out there.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if the world was filled with Christians and the non-Christians were all self-described praxeologists, or however you would say that, that would be preferable. Yeah. I mean, have you ever read before? Probably end this part of the discussion here, but one thing I was going to ask was if you've ever read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
I think I've read parts of it years ago,
okay,
maybe a decade ago.
I would encourage you to, if you want a book to look into more of the stuff I was talking about, because for me, I don't come at it from the dogmatic heaven and hell.
Yes.
Ultimately it's philosophical for me, where I'm coming from, the belief in God in the metaphysical sense. And then from there, it ties into Christianity as kind of a second step. But it's a good book to check out if you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely have a very positive connotation of C.S. Lewis and his contributions, to that sort of rational Christianity.
Who was secretly an anarchist. not really secretly,
Oh,
but
that's fun.
not just low key known. I mean, he basically said his political affiliation. If he said in a letter once to someone like that his political affiliations were, uh, you know, leaning more and more towards that of anarchy because, he's like, man is, the Christian belief, man is sinful, and if that's true, it's like, there's no man that's uh, fit to rule over another. Was the way he put it, but yeah, I definitely
Yeah,
recommend checking that out.
I I
But
will.
yeah, I definitely agree with your. Uh, I love praxeology. I think that these things do kind of fit together like puzzle pieces, and that uh, I would definitely uh, like to see more libertarians look into not just praxeology in the Austrian economic sense, but just in the life sense, and uh, that's also a window into the Christian worldview that might be able to bring more Christians into rejecting the state, and that's definitely something I'll have to keep in mind. Um, was there anything else on the praxeology stuff that you had wanted to say that that didn't get said, or do you think we covered that pretty well?
Um, yeah, I mean that was talked about most of the main things I like to throw out there and see, what people think. But since you were familiar with the the concept of praxeology, um, yeah, I mean those are basically the way that I look at it. I just see it as so transcendent across um, every aspect of our life that it's just a useful
Agreed. I agree.
framework. Yeah.
We we'll touch on a couple things here near the end. We we met through a Facebook page called Fakertarians, uh,
Yes.
which is an
Yes, we did.
interesting group, and you and I are a bit of the oddballs in the group because not just because of our beliefs, but also our associations, because we're both uh, associated with the Mises Caucus, and there's been a lot of drama over the past year, which I'm sure you're
Yeah,
probably familiar with a good bit of that.
sure.
Uh, what
Well,
was your?
yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, no, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was going to ask on your take. It's a little bit of, a little bit of gossip and drama here at the end. What was your take on kind of the whole? I mean, like, were you kind of watching with the whole initial start of this, where John Hudak, the guy that one of the admins of Fakertarians, went on uh, Dave Smith's show and challenged him on his uh, affiliations with guys like Molyneux and what's the other guy, like Fuentes and stuff, and how that kind of spiraled into this. Now the Mises Caucus, not just with Fakertarians, but in general, the Mises Caucus has this very adversarial uh, role in the LP internal politics, and just the way everything's played out over the past year has been interesting. I have my own thoughts on both sides, but I was just kind of curious for someone else who's uh, similar worldview and who's seen this stuff unfold, what your takes on all that drama was.
Yeah, well, I think uh, I'm hesitant to embrace some of the rhetoric of the Mises Caucus about the Libertarian Party, like calling itself the Libertarian wing of the Libertarian Party and stuff like that. And I don't think I said this before, but the first time I heard the word praxeology was on a Dave Smith podcast. And I remember like I was mowing my grass at my old house in Florida, and I was just like, how have I never heard this word? And it was just like him talking for 30 minutes. It wasn't like I mean, he did a nice job summarizing the concept and how Mises and Rothbard, dug into it. But it was like, that was a moment that I just remember being like, how have I never heard this word? And I've looked, I talked to my, fellow libertarians, they weren't familiar with it. And I think to go more to your point is that Dave Smith, I'm a big fan of. I think he's got a lot of great content, but I think that there's a bit of in the sense of the ethos versus pathos argument, where he's more caught up in the philosophy, that ethos argument, and so he has more in common in his mind with other people with kind of conservative principles who are about limited government on a superficial way. I think Stefan Molyneux has a lot of great content. He says some weird stuff for sure, but there's a lot of very wise and insightful things that he's said. Peaceful parenting. I read some of his like stuff from like 2002, and it was just great. I mean, it was just like just beautifully done in this libertarian, and it just has a really nice way of writing. But he also, says weird things, and I'm totally against. Like I'll just to talk about to kind of go back to my very beginning with the campaign. Like the first time I considered running was when I was encouraged to by James Weeks, who's the naked guy of the LP. Right. So he's the chair of my county party. I'm the vice chair. And we have, spirited discussions. He's a bit of a libertarian socialist, an interesting character. I mean, I've enjoyed, our discussions and our banter. But like, to me, like from Fakertarians to Mises Caucus, like we just have, at least most have similar principles, similar goals, but different priorities and how we apply that. And I think that pathos and ethos tension is, it really encapsulates. And like the Mises Caucus is trying to, like Hornberger was a great example of that, like, being very rigid and according to like these principles, we cannot, have any mealy mouth stuff. And like, I'm all for that in the philosophy of it, but in terms of the persuasion part of it, in terms of trying to actually share the message in a way that, connects with people, I think that it's not helpful to try to, isolate and to be a little bit overly, critical of the Libertarian Party more generally. And I'll admit, like, I had very little interest in the Libertarian Party for most of my time as a libertarian. I mean, I voted for Gary the couple times I have voted, but I don't see it as that useful of a thing. But it was an opportunity for me to get on the ballot. I didn't have to get any signatures. I was the only signature I had to sign to my own to get on the ballot. So like, Libertarian Party was a means for me to kind of go on that adventure. But I think overall, like, I think the Mises Caucus is hugely important, and I hope that it, on some level, does take over the Libertarian Party. That's what I'm hoping to try to help do as a part of the Mises Caucus, is to bring in more people who are, principled and want to grow the party and work on a local basis, especially to minimize the damage that government does in our society. So I think, the fact that one of the things that the Fakertarian group talks about and works on is bottom unity, which is a phrase that I didn't realize what it meant until somewhat recently, but I really like it. And I think it goes well with the idea of, combining the empathy argument with the property rights argument.
Right.
Trying to translate that between the different sects. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really funny how this feud between these two groups is almost, it's very well characterized and exemplified by the actual feud between the LPMC and, as they call them, the loser brigade, the Fakertarians people. And it's just funny because at the end of the day, if you take a guy like John Hudak and Michael Heiss, on actual like policy issues and core philosophy, probably very little different.
Yeah.
But they have different mindsets, and I think John more affiliates himself with libertarians who view things kind of more in that the left mindset, but the LPMC seems to be heading in this direction where they're very much in that right wing mindset. And to me, that's my main issue with them, is just that they've become so divisive. Not that being divisive is always bad, but it just seems like they're too willing to fall into this dichotomy and this culture war that to me just is ultimately not just unwinnable, but you shouldn't be winnable, because to me, I appreciate. Yeah. And what's weird to me is that, and I'm not trying to call people out here. I mean, I know a lot of the Mises guys, the core guys, pretty well. I know, and I've met and talked to Mike, and I love Mike. Mike's a big Peterson fan too. So it just seems weird to me that, Mike should know, from Peterson, the importance of left and right. But he seems to, I think the group has kind of just fallen into this pattern of when they became under attack by certain people, instead of trying to incorporate those attacks, instead of bearing that cross nobly, it seems like they kind of went into the eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth mode.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Kind of the wrong,
I think
the wrong response, which is not like, on one level you can understand the response, but on the other hand, it's like, but is that the response that leads to long-term success and what your vision is? I guess it depends on what your vision is, but if your vision is, to actually achieve liberty in our lifetime to make the LP a force for good, uh, and a force for liberty. It doesn't seem to me like this is a good this scorched earth left versus right strategy doesn't seem to me to be a good long term
Yeah,
uh,
I would say
way to
in
orient
some
yourself.
absolutely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, mostly at least. And I think one of the best excuses in terms of why the Mises Caucus would be more ornery and maybe divisive was Sarwark and his antics and his attacks of some of my favorite libertarians, and the petty way that he operated for so long. I mean, and one of the things he said, like you kind of just mentioned there, was the world set free in our lifetime. That was something he always said. I don't know where he got that, or if that's kind of his original thing. But like I think in so many ways he made it where the Mises Caucus had to be responsive and reactionary, maybe in that sense. But I think there are certain tendencies that it seems like the Tea Party, where it's like, we're the real principled ones. We're coming in to take over the party kind of stuff. And I think that that could be helpful, but it's not in what you were saying there. I think about Jordan Peterson is it's not the best way to approach the long term goals and priorities
Right.
within. And so, I mean, yeah, I think very very highly of most of the people that I know in the Mises Caucus. But I also like I really like James Weeks, and I like a lot of the left leaning. I've learned some. I really had anarcho communists that I've engaged with on Twitter, or and read other things. Roderick Long is another one who I think is excellent and makes great points, and he's more of a left leaning libertarian. I think people would describe him that way. Um, but I think that approach of praxeology is the solution, right? Recognizing that we're all students, and these are just students who are playing a slightly different game and in a slightly different approach than the way that we're studying the problems. But as we can focus on what are the common problems that we identify and where our solutions are disparate, where we have different approaches to how to solve those problems, we can recognize the value of others rather than I think I would say that the loser brigade stuff and the way that they come at Dave just because he talks to people, that's just terrible. I mean, I think that's intolerant and useless and just like so reductionist and oversimplified, and I think so that part of it I think is just as counterproductive and petty and like being mad at people for having discussions with people they disagree with is not something that I don't understand, to be honest. And I come from my focus is always that, like, if you're offended, if you're like, bothered by other people, then you're like making a bad choice and you're losing. You know what I mean? Like the idea that other people's actions can control your emotions is kind of pathetic. And not that it's like it's not something that never get angry or something like that, but just as much as possible you realize that you have control over your own choices and your own emotions, and the way that you govern uh your uh um the way that you operate is up to you. And so I think yeah, that was most of my thoughts, at least on the whole infighting of the Libertarian Party stuff. But I like to think I really my goal is to be more like Alex Merced is someone who I have a lot of love for. Larry Sharp is another one who they employ positive messages as much as possible. And so I have a lot of love for anybody who hates the state or wants to see way less government. But and I would even admit, maybe I don't know if I could say this carefully enough, but like I have similar opinions of, like, President Obama and President Trump. Like, they're just people out there playing games, and they're bad examples of it. They're not in any way libertarian, but I think, like, you can still look at them as individuals and recognize that they're just people pursuing their interests. And so rather than getting mad at the individuals who operate according to the incentives already built into the system, that our animosity as anarchists, as libertarians, is to point at the problems of the system, to point at the problems of the coercive hierarchy that causes unnecessary suffering, that inflicts pain on people. And so I think that that's the way that our messaging should always go. And the petty stuff, attacking Dave Smith for talking to, and I think that Nick Fuentes guy is, silly. I didn't listen to that interview, but the stuff I've seen from him, like that's, dumb. I don't know why Dave would talk to him, but I mean, hey, that guy has a platform. Dave, whatever. That's fine. Just talk to people. You're on mute, bro.
Sorry. Yeah, I agree. It's with the Molyneux and Fuentes stuff. It's like, I'm okay with criticizing Dave for his interactions with them to an extent. But where Vegetarian just goes too far, I think, is sometimes engaging into that cancel culture kind of thing, where it's like, well, because they did X, we need to censor these people or disassociate with
It's
them.
collectivist thinking a lot of times. I
It
think it's
is,
like, oh,
and
it's a danger to platform people.
well, and
It's
it's
like,
just
yeah,
it's just looking at things in such black and white. Like you brought up Molyneux. Listen, there's a lot of stuff Molyneux says that, like, if you played clips of it, I'd go, that's messed up, or that's ridiculous.
yes,
That's awful.
sure,
But at the same time, there's a lot of things he says and does that's like, that's amazing. That's peaceful parenting
yeah,
had a huge impact on my life. The stuff he taught. I mean, Molyneux was one of the guys I got into when I first became an anarchist. And so it's like, I remember all the good stuff he did, and I always try to remember that when I hear some of his newer stuff, which I don't agree with, but
yeah,
uh, it's just like unwillingness to deal with nuance sometimes, and that's
sure,
where the left can, like I said before, it's like they get caught up in outrage. Uh,
yeah,
I guess the last thing we wanted to talk about here, maybe challenge you a bit on, uh, you kind of said at the beginning you felt silly for almost at times during your campaign. And while we were talking about praxeology, one of the things about praxeology is scarce resources. And like I said at the beginning, it's not just material; it's our time. We only have a finite amount of hours and minutes to uh, spend on this earth, and we should want to maximize them. Now, I'm not like some of the anarchists who uh, look at people who get involved in the LP and in voting and demonize them. Say you're not a real anarchist, whatnot.
yes,
It's
yes,
not my style. But I am someone who sometimes questions uh, the effectiveness of that strategy. And this I thought would be an interesting last take, kind of looking at things in the framework of praxeology. Do you think that involvement in politics, in whether it's the LP or if you want to be like Ron Paul and try to join one of the duopoly parties and try to do something there, I mean, do you think that those are effective? Do you think they have a certain place? My sense is sort of that they have limited, if any, utility. And it's not that I demonize them, but I just think of the opportunity costs and like, well, sure, I could do this and that might accomplish X, but I can think of maybe 10 other things I could do that I think long term would be more effective. So what's your thoughts on that?
yeah. That was certainly my main thought when the idea first popped into my head. When in my county meeting we were talking about, and I brought up who's going to be the congressional candidate. Is there anyone? And and James and Jeff said I should do it, and I was like, heck no, no chance. That's a total waste of time. I enjoy working or having our county meetings, but we don't really do anything, and I don't see the LP as that useful a vehicle. But with I thought the chair position, I like Joe Bishop Henchman a lot. I think he's a really solid leader, and I am trying to help grow the Mises Caucus, so that was a part of what I wanted to do. And I thought also there should be a libertarian name on the ballot. We have ballot access, and the governor, aside the point, we have ballot access. And so I thought it would be an interesting opportunity. And one thing that really got me as to go back an extra year was that in summer 2019, I saw a poster to participate in community theater, and so I auditioned to be in Mamma Mia, I, sang and danced and got up on stage with a bagpipe and pretended to be drunk after a bachelor party. It was an incredible experience. And I was like a part of a team and like, made, new friends and had a new experience. And it was really difficult. And I felt like that experience, I was like trying to find something new to do this summer because obviously all the theaters were shut down and I wasn't really planning to do that anyway. But it was just like, that was such an incredible opportunity as like a civic experience of being a part of a community organization. And I thought maybe this politician thing would be like that. And honestly, I found that so much more fulfilling and edifying of being a part of the theater, which whatever, it was kind of silly, but I had a great time. And I felt like it was just, it was really valuable and just an enjoyable, like you said, about resource out, using means available. And so I had time. And anyway, so my experience of the performance part of that, and saying my silly lines and people laughing, it kind of inspired me to have a little more courage to go out and be a politician for a few months. And I thought it'd be fun to, hopefully get into debate, which didn't happen, and have some conversations. The Brian Nichols show was one that I did recently, and some others where I got to talk to fellow libertarians and encourage, like I don't know how many libertarians in the party are, out there with, the type of message that I have. I know nobody else is saying praxeology is their religion, but like I also like to talk about how we should apply the non-aggression principle to our communication. I think that that's a concept that like if we're not being aggressive, that calling people dumb and being condescending is not exactly aggression, but it's also not compatible with being persuasive. Right? By
Right.
putting persuasion and empathy at the center of our message, that will be most effective in trying to actually communicate and actually grow libertarianism within people's hearts or within the cultural discourse, like whatever the goal is. That I thought I could maybe add a little bit to it, and at least there'd be a libertarian name on the ballot. So I guess overall I'm glad that I did it. I'll be a former congressional candidate soon as like a little tagline to a personality trait of mine. But in terms of overall the effectiveness, honestly, no, I don't think it's all that effective. I don't plan to do it again. I hope I can, have help other people run, especially for like the U.S. Congress level. Like if I were to, if I did want to be in public office, maybe I could run, but I don't really want to do that. Like you had said, I don't think it's the most effective way to do it. I don't want to be wielding power. I certainly don't want to sit in like meetings with Robert Rules of Order and all that jazz. Like, nah, man, like that's not a good use of my time. I'd much rather do other things. And so yeah, I don't mean to defend it. I listened to, like I mentioned, your conversation with Craig. I think Craig Hargis was the name, the Bad Roman
Yeah.
Project, and
Yeah.
like I totally understood where he was coming from, and I'm sure he would see, think that I'm a bit hypocritical for being an anarchist or a self-proclaimed anarchist at least, and being on the ballot for like the silly popularity contest of democracy. But at the same time, it was a means to my ends of trying to, to tie it back, like this was a pursuit of my own self-interest. I wanted to make some connections. I wanted to try to enhance my ability to be persuasive, and to have conversations with people. And I had some great conversations. I also wasted some time talking to people who made some very silly claims and whatever. But overall, it was something to do during our lockdowns and whatever. So
I view
yeah,
involvement in the LP as almost like analogous to when a person turns 21 and has to go out and get sorry, I'm gonna curse here, has to get shit faced really bad at least once. It's like
yeah,
when you
okay,
when you become
I
an
guess.
anarchist or you're on that journey, it's like
Yeah,
it is a necessary stepping stone to put yourself into the political arena of the LP. Like not necessary like it does
yeah,
anything, but like in your personal journey, everyone has to go through that sort of because it's like that was my argument to Craig. Wasn't so much that I disagreed with him on the end point of like, sure, yeah, voting is a waste, politics is mostly a waste, and I didn't
yes,
really disagree with him, but I was like, most people don't get there in one fell swoop, and for the people that aren't there yet, I'll encourage them to make that first step from being a Republican to a Libertarian, and from
sure, yeah,
a big
absolutely,
a major status to a small status like a minarchist.
yeah,
And if someone's convinced they're going to be involved in politics and there's a group of people doing that like the Mises Caucus, then I will offer whatever aid I feel comfortable offering insofar as like, well, they're already convinced they're going to do that, so I'll support them in doing that insofar as there's some commonality there, and it's not taking too much of my time and resources. But
Yeah, I spent $0 except for a little bit of gas money on my campaign. I
right,
didn't get T-shirts or signs or anything like that. I didn't want to, use any resources other than my, a couple hours a day at the most. Maybe more like a few hours a week
right.
would
And
be what I did. And yeah,
if you're
lining
gonna
up
do
some
it,
interviews. Yeah.
right, yeah, if you're gonna do it, that's the way to do it. Because like I was talking to someone today, actually, another Christian anarchist, who is more of like Craig's persuasion, where it's like, oh, if you vote or you run for office, you're like supporting Satan, and
Yeah, I
it's
don't
like,
think, voting is violence is not something that I find compelling. It's like in the same way, you may as well vote if you have the opportunity to. In the same way, the government's going to try to mess with you in so many ways. It's like an older person getting their social security benefit. That's like, the way that the system is built right now. So doing your small part and getting, what you're entitled to, your vote is whatever it's worth. Like if it's something you want to do it. If it's something, I mean, I'll probably vote as long as the weather's nice enough on Tuesday for myself and for, Joe and Spike. Uh,
yeah, I mean, it's
and I
like
really like Spike. I think Spike's pretty great.
I like Spike. It's like I don't view people voting in the fashions you're describing as being on voting in the same way that the the majority of the public does, because like the way that voting, because like libertarians are voting when they're voting either defensively or in a protest,
Yeah,
and
I
it's
think
like
though. Yeah,
and it's like I don't have a moral qualm with that, other than when it wastes excessive time and resources, like when the campaigns, and I know that the campaign Joe and Spike are running doesn't, it dwarfs in comparison to like Trump and Biden, but we're still talking about just tons of money and time that people are investing into something they know is essentially just a protest vote because they're not going to win. And
but it's a
it's
way to
like
get some people's attention. And I
it,
think
it
that
is, it
the
is.
connection between like Ron Paul running for president compared to all of his time actually being in Congress. Like in Congress, he didn't get anything that he wanted. Maybe there are a few things over
True.
the years, but right, he didn't have much influence. But the platform of the presidential campaign or just generally being on the ballot, like I had opportunities to talk to people and have interviews and media connections that I wouldn't have otherwise had. And who knows, maybe I planted some little seed of libertarianism in,
Yeah.
I know a couple of my little cousins enjoyed it, some of the stuff that I said, and they had never heard, my philosophy before. And so who knows, I think that was my motivation for it. That was the sort of the thing I couldn't escape when I was trying to decide whether or not to do this. Cause yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
I hear
my
where
wife
you're,
supported me, and
yeah.
she thought I should do it. And yeah, so that was a
I absolutely hear where you're coming from. I interviewed another guy named, it's confusing. There's so many Craigs. There's Kevin Craig, who I'm talking about now, which is different than Craig Hargis.
yes, yeah.
But Kevin Craig is also similar to you. Uh, he's done it for a while though. He's run multiple times in his area,
Yeah.
and not to win, but he's just doing it. He says he does it to get a soapbox, to get a platform,
Yeah.
to plant seeds, and I get where that's coming from. Uh, I'm not big on trying to go out and condemn people and say you're terrible for doing this, but I do think that uh, the the talk of praxeology does encourage us to just make sure that we are always using our time as effectively as possible. If our aim is to not, and not even just in terms of reach people with the message of liberty, but just also to do good in this world. And can you reach people from and plant seeds from the position of office or running for office? You can. You could also probably do it if you were out there in a soup kitchen, or if you're out there volunteer firefighter service, or if you're out there I can know some people that just go out there to the polls themselves when people are going out there to vote, and talk with people, hold up signs while they're going in. So, uh, yeah,
Well, I do think
just stuff to
also,
think about. And it's not that I'm trying to say, again, I'm not judging you or trying to say like, you
sure.
bad anarchist. And this,
Well,
it
I do
sounds like
feel a little hypocritical. I'll
it,
admit, man. Yeah, like some of
right,
the arguments that Craig Hargis was making, I was like, yeah, no, I feel that for sure, and that was
right.
part of my hesitation. But I think that there's something about the concept of service where this was a way that I could serve, not in any sort of like self-sacrificial or like for the greater good sort of thing, but like being a part of a team, similar to the community theater experience, where it was like being a part of something a little bit bigger to try to deliver something and be a part of to help whatever I could do within the Libertarian Party and at least a lot of times complaining about the government. I'm sure you've gotten this too, with people, regular status, and if you hate the government so much, what are you going to do about it? Kind of. And so this is
Right.
what I did. This is my little adventure, and honestly, I'm glad it's almost over. One thing we didn't talk about. This has been one of the big issues on my campaign was to try to end the chaos of clock changing. We have the Daylight Act was a bill that I was trying to raise some awareness of to end, the federal mandate of switching your clocks back and forth. So I failed. My loftiest goal of the campaign was that we wouldn't have fallen back last night, but yeah, so we're stuck, switching our clocks around again. One of
Right.
my best sales pitch too is 2020 has been a rough year, so let's make it 1 hour shorter. And I thought maybe that could catch on, but I don't even know how to raise awareness for something like that. I guess I've probably expanded my social media profile a little bit, but like I hate Facebook, and I don't want to be there anymore, but I feel still obligated to kind of, I don't know, but trying to find ways to serve and to get to refine the way that I talk about these issues and to connect with people. And
Right.
I had so many conversations with people who basically care about one or two issues. They do
Right.
not care about anything else, like just in terms of like regular voters who I had the opportunity to speak to. They care about abortion, or they care about like just one small issue. They care about social security or healthcare, or like whatever the one thing is. And it's
Yeah.
like, but from my broader, just a chance to express libertarian values to them and kind of explain where I'm coming from and hear their perception. So
The balance, the praxeological balance that we have to to make, like the calculation you have to make is you want to be principled and you want to use your time efficiently, but you also don't want to be so tied to your principles that you cut yourself off from conversations with people and being able to meet them where they're at. And
yes,
that's a tough calculation. And I have grace. Not that I'm not trying to judge Craig or anyone else. It's like I understand. It's like they see the principles clearly. They want to cling to them strongly, and it's like I don't have a problem with that too much.
well, yeah,
But I feel convicted to kind of like I don't want to turn people off just because they aren't there yet, because I just know from my journey, there are times where people had to do that for me, where it was like they're trying to get me to Z, I'm stuck over back at like Q, and they're like, well, I can't get you from Q to Z in one step, but maybe I can get from Q to V, and
sure,
then come back a few months later, and then you'll go from V to Y, and then you'll get to Z.
yeah.
So it's
Well,
like,
I think the idea that the thing that, like, in the conflict back and forth with you and Greg there was the premise that he was applying his values to your actions, and you just had a
right.
different subjective value hierarchy that you were looking at in the way that governed your actions.
Well,
And I
yeah,
think that
that's yeah, I
I think
agree.
that's a perfect, and so to some degree, right, the approach that I would advocate for is to be a student rather than to kind of be a teacher or be critical of others. Just look at them as, I wonder why, since we share these values, why does he have a different opinion than I do? Right? It's not like you're an anarchist so you can't vote. Like, people can be anarchists and do lots of different things. People can be anarchists and work for the government. To me, I mean, like, whatever. If you have a certain philosophical premise and you're using that in a way that adheres to your principles, then go for it. Now, I would maybe find some of that strange. Like, there are certain things that someone might do that I would think maybe that's inconsistent, but I'd be more curious and humble to hear their rationale and hear their longer, because I'm sure that they've already thought about it, or at least we should. One of the Jordan Peterson, think that the person that you're listening to or you're talking to has something that you could learn. I butchered what he was saying, but that's the premise of it, right? It's like, treat other people as though you can learn from them. And I think that sums up that concept of being a student, in the way that we look at ourselves and others, and how we see other people's actions. and guess that probably they've thought of our opinion, but they don't apply it in the same way that we do. So I think, yeah, it's all just opinions and values, and we can work for common goals just in different ways. But yeah, many of the things that he said, I'll admit, like he definitely. I was like, yep, no, I agree. I feel that little bit of guilt and hypocritical nature of it, that by participating in this, I am kind of violating, just by being, I don't know. There's something that does feel a little bit dirty about it. I'll be honest, like just being on the ballot in this silly thing and having, like, I would say the worst part has been having to have so many conversations about like, what would you do in office in this specific
Right.
situation. It's just like, yeah, no, that's not what I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about more philosophy, but unfortunately, like the nature of the conversations I was having was more like, what would you do to improve the Affordable Care Act?
See, that is my
Yeah,
worry. That's my
yeah,
worry with the LPMC is just like it, everything you engage in requires a compromise, and the more you engage with politics, I just feel like the more compromises you make to maybe you don't see it now, but down the road, you might have shifted on things too much in order to stay in that arena. And it's almost like the more success you have in that arena, it's a reflection of how much you've compromised, and that's my concern. But
I think that could be true, but I think at least the best version of the Mises Caucus argument against that to me is the primary focus on decentralization, right?
true, true,
Localized issues, getting things like, just getting the red tape out of the way on the local level, to decentralizing power from the federal back to the states, like on every level, focus on decentralizing with the goal being individual power rather than collective control, right?
right.
So I think, that's the best approach to it, and I guess that's what I've tried to adopt in the way that I've spouted my rhetoric. But
Right.
yeah, I think I totally, yeah, I see where you're coming from, and I feel you. And I think to get into positions of power, it does require compromise like that for the most part, unless you're able to start on this like lower level where it doesn't take as much you know sucking up to the powers that be to get into those positions. So I think there are Mises Caucus people getting elected at local levels and city council or whatever, and I think people like that can make a big difference.
Well,
Having
and it's like, what I like about this is that it's a conversation, and we're figuring it out as we go. I think sometimes people get too caught up in like it's like, here are my principles, here's what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to do it. Not trying to judge, but me, I'm much more of a like, sure, I have core principles, but at the same time, it's like, uh, I like having the conversation. I like hashing things out. I like being open to changing my mind and letting good arguments and good data and good reasons, influence, how I tweak that value system to affect my actions. And that's my heart. I'm a conversationalist, and this has been a good conversation. Uh, we've gone on now for a little bit longer
yeah,
than intended, but it's
yeah.
the way it goes sometimes. I liked what we covered. I'm
Me too, man.
glad.
Yeah, this was
Yeah,
a lot of fun. I really appreciate you for sure. This was
yeah.
good.
I was glad. Glad you reached out. So we'll definitely do this again, and uh, cover more about uh, ways to apply this to. Because I'd like to do that maybe sometime. Talk about uh, ways to personally apply this, both not just in politics and philosophy, not just politics, but philosophically speaking to life. Maybe we'll do that sometime. But other than that, good night. Enjoy what's the uh, extra hour you gained or lost, depending on how you value 2020.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a daylight tax day.
Yeah.
They tax it away in the afternoon. And then they call it savings when they give it back to us in the spring. So,
Right, right.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's that's government for you. Take something and call it value.
Yep. Yep. That's what they do. Our 25-hour day today. So yeah. Um, but
Well,
yeah, thanks, Jacob. It was a lot of fun, man. I really enjoyed this. I
yep.
think, yeah.
Me too, man. All right. Have a good night.
All right, brother. You too. God
All right.
bless.
You too. Bye.